Hey now, greetings. Welcome to the stream. I realize I started a bit late here. I actually couldn't find my glasses, if you could believe it. Let me just get the, let me get that pinned there. And we'll sort of get the word out to people here. Well, YouTube is giving me a bit of a problem here, isn't it? I think I might have to reload this. Did this go up? Oh, here it is. Okay. Like I was trying to make this go live, and it got stuck. There we go. Okay, yeah. I had meant to start at 7:30 sharp, but that didn't happen. I couldn't find my glasses. We found them now. Go ahead and just do the normal pre-stream advertisement. Okay. There we go. Yeah. Offerty, am I saying it correctly? Thank you for subscribing using Amazon Prime. Welcome to the stream. How are you today? I think I've actually seen your name around before, but thank you for the Amazon Prime subscription. That does mean a lot to support the channel. Thank you. Happy to catch one of these live. I see. Well, I'm always happy to do them. I've been looking forward to them for so long, and I was a little late getting started because I had misplaced my glasses. I had just taken a shower, and I could not find my glasses. They were sitting on the edge of the bed, and they had fallen off. And yeah. Crown Lands. Yes, I remember that. I have a tab open to remind myself to look into them more. You see, the problem with me is that when it comes to collecting music, well, notice I use the word collecting, I get very obsessive. And I will find a group that I will obsess over, and I have to have everything. And I'll just get all their albums, and then the EPs, and the live albums, and the singles, and the bootlegs, and everything. And sometimes it can be quite the undertaking, you know? It could be quite the undertaking. Yes, I'm just sort of playing catch-up with myself here, trying to get everything situated in terms of social media and whatnot. Okay, that's done. And I should probably message Laurel, since I know that Laurel likes to try to get to see these, you know. Actually, no, well, it's the Council of Tolkien, but I don't think, has she been here for a reading yet? I'm gonna message her either way. Where are you, Laurel? There you are. That's done. Okay. Oh, and Hitomi, I'll probably have to message her as well. Okay. Yes, I have a tab open for Crown Lands. It's just like I said, there are certain things that I guess it's just part of my makeup. Like I'll just become obsessed over something, and then very rarely will I ever let it go, which is how the Tolkien thing started. You know. I don't know if I've ever told this story, but when I was in the 3rd grade, I had this teacher with, oh, hey, Sarah, and thank you for subscribing, and we just got a hype train on a Tolkien stream. That's the first time that we've seen that in the whole hype train. It's all different. It looks different than it did the last time. If we have any moderators here or anybody that would just do this as a favor to me to run over to the Discord and let them know that there's a hype train going. Thank you very much, Sarah. That's 48 months. Wow. But let me tell you guys the story real quick. It's not a long story of how I came to become obsessed with Tolkien. I was in the third Was it the third? It was either the third or the fourth grade. I want to say it was the third grade. I had this teacher who was very much into children reading, but she didn't. She knew that when you're a teacher, and you thank you, Alice, and welcome to the stream. When you assign books to the class, they almost never like the books. It's always sort of like, oh, you're making me read this, therefore I don't like it. I've seen this like with my nephews and such. They like reading. But thank you for the bits, Sarah. I've been dropping no eaves, Mr. Gandalf. Honest. Eavesdropping? Sam is always dropping those eaves. You know what an eave is, Sarah? By the way, it's interesting. It's the under part of the portion of a house's roof that juts out. The under part is the eave, and hobbits don't live in. Well, some of them live in houses, but Frodo certainly didn't live in a house. So he certainly wouldn't have had eaves because he really didn't have a roof. His roof was the hill, Bagshot Row. So, but anyway, I was in the third or fourth grade. I forget which. I think it was the third grade. I had this teacher. She was very interested in getting children to read. So she had something called independent reading, where basically you had to read a book. And the gift subs are flying here. Alice, thank you for the gift subs. Who got gift subs? Let's see. Afin, Almighty Santa, Greg, Gulax, and Legendary Sandwich God? I think that one might be a bot. But thank you. It doesn't matter. Thank you so much. Sometimes bots get gift subs in those sort of blitzes there. Thank you very much. We've reached level 3. We're going to get emotes and whatnot. So we had this thing called an independent reading folder. And basically you would have to, every night, read for half an hour. And you could go more, but it had to be at least a half an hour. And you had to write down what book you were. It was like a chart. What book you were reading, what time, what page you started at, and then what page you ended at, and then your parent should sign it. And she would just check to make sure that kids were doing it. She didn't care what you were reading. She didn't want you to write reports on the books that you read. Hey, Moogle. She didn't quiz you on anything. She didn't make any sort of criteria. Like it just had to be a book. It didn't matter. It could be anything. And she was the only teacher that I ever had that did anything like this, which I thought was really great because it let us pick what we wanted. And I was reading at the time a lot of science fiction. Hey, Greg, you have been summoned by Alice's gift sub, indeed. A lot of science fiction books, mostly science fiction that was aimed at children. But then one day my mother gave me a copy of a book, The Hobbit. And that's, and it was not like anything I ever read before. The first line in it, which, do I have The Hobbit sitting here? We're not reading The Hobbit today, but that's the Two Towers. I don't have The Hobbit with me right now. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, and then it goes on to describe there's not a bad hole, it's a nice hole, and all this, and it sets your mind into this sort of world, right? And I just remember, following Bilbo's journey. Like I said, I was reading a lot of science fiction, but I've always been very interested in fantastical stuff. And, the part that I remember really stuck with me, really, really stuck with me as a child, was Mirkwood Forest. Because that was where there was a little bit of a horror element to it as well, which was something that was a big influence on me as well. Hello there, the Ode? Am I saying it right? The Ode? Welcome to the stream. Welcome to the stream. So, so that I read The Hobbit, and it stuck with me, especially the Mirkwood section. And I remember just a few years later, I had read the Fellowship of the Ring, and then, it was interesting because, things were getting to be so much more dire and so much different But the moment that it became an obsession, though, was because I read The Lord of the Rings, and I read The Hobbit, and then I would go back and read The Hobbit, and go back and read The Lord of the Rings, and I would read other books, of course. But on the bookshelf, my parents' bookshelf, I found this book by J.R.R. Tolkien called Unfinished Tales. And it had all this information, kind of like the appendix, but different, because it was a lot about the First Age, and it had, little Silmarillion bits in it, and it had stuff about Numenor, and what really captured my imagination was it had stuff about the wizards. There was this whole section called the Istari, which was all about the wizards, because it was mentioned in The Lord of the Rings that there were 5 of them, and it's like, okay, well, we know about Gandalf and Saruman and Radagast, who are the other 2. And I was sort of very, very interested in finding out that they're not just like old men who can use magic, that they're essentially angels. And, this is where it became really, really an obsession to learn more about it. Oh, thank you. And I Corey is, he streams on here as well. I don't know if you knew that. He actually was the one that inspired me to take all this stuff swimming around in my head to the masses, because I saw a video from, I don't know if it was Wired or one of those sort of magazines that had a video on YouTube about where experts answer questions on things, and it was Professor Corey Olson. And there we go, the hype. Everybody that was in the hype train can open their chests. Let's see, what did I get here? It's like a cool little duck. I like it. It's cute. Thank you for everyone that participated in the hype train. The cool little duck there. Corey did this thing, where he was talking about answering people's questions, and he had a way about him that explained it. Like, he didn't say anything in the video that I didn't know about, but he explained it in a very simple way that I was like, that's interesting, the way he doesn't just read off the passages. He breaks it down for you, and I bet I could do that. And I discovered Quora. And Quora is a website where you could ask any kind of question and have people that are experts in their fields answer. And thank you for the, I almost said 1000. I mean, technically, it's like saying 11D1, right? 1,050 bits there, Alice. Thank you so much. And I went to Quora to see, are people asking Tolkien questions, and I found that they were, and I started in on that, and then I was like, well, this is great, but I feel like I need to be talking, so I started the YouTube channel, and I already stream every day on Twitch, so I'm sort of used to broadcasting and speaking into a microphone and such. Anyway, guys, we're going to get started here, because I've been looking forward to this stream for a while now. I've been itching to do it. I'm a little bit tired. You can certainly, you know what, before we start, go ahead, ask me questions, because we're going to kill the music and we're going to read, this is the Return of the King, that's not what I need. Here we are. The Fellowship of the Ring. Go ahead, and you could ask questions at any point, and I'll answer them, if I'm in the middle of reading, because we're not just going to read the book, we're going to talk about it, we're going to analyze it and everything. But, hey, WT, Ed, if you ask a question, I will get to it as soon as I can, of course. Let's see. Where is my other chat thing? So I can put it over here. Here we are. So, yeah. You have to be there near the next bit emote. I could probably find out for you. Let's see. Well, what is the most recent one that you've unlocked? You don't have the slime, do you? The slime is like the last one. I need to create one beyond the slime. Okay. There's only like 2 people that have the slime. The slime is really cute. It's actually my favorite. Let me just pop that into the chat there. I think the slime's cute. I drew the slime and I put the surprise Pikachu face on it. And I just like it. It's still cute to me. But anyway, yeah. Let's go ahead. We're gonna kill the music as soon as I find the tab that it's coming from. Just real pro streamer stuff going on right here today. I was in such a rush. I couldn't find my glasses. I'm running all over the place, not knowing where I left them when I took a shower. So it was a mess today. Oh, you just unlocked the slime? Oh, yeah. Sometimes it takes a little bit to deliver it. I'm going to have to create an emote beyond the slime. We're going to come over here. I'm going to have to create something for people to attain to beyond the slime. Maybe we'll put like the Eye of Sauron or something. Like, actually, you know what? From the YouTube channel, I do have something really cool. I have a Silmaril I could put there. I have a Silmaril that I drew that I could put in there. But let's we're going to read the Fellowship of the Ring. My copy looks a little different from that, but very similar, right? It's not a first edition or anything, but it's a similar sort of copy there. Beyond the Slime sounds like a cheap fantasy novel. As long as it's not written by Stephen Donaldson, I think we're good, right? All right, so recap for the Fellowship of the Ring being the first part of the Lord of the Rings. They have traveled out of the Shire, obviously, and they went through the Old Forest, and a lot of things happened there. They met Tom Bombadil. I had a lot to say about that. They met Goldberry. I had a lot to say about her. Frodo had some more prophetic dreams. One of them was a vision of Gandalf standing at the top of Orthanc. And then after they ate with Tom Bombadil, he played with the ring for a little while, and they left on their journey. But then they got accosted by the Barrow Wights. We talked about the sort of theories as to what Barrow Wights actually are, their origins and such. And of course, they got captured by the Barrow Wight, and Tom Bombadil rescued them because Frodo remembered the little song that can summon Tom Bombadil as long as you were close to him. And then he escorted them to the edge of Arthedain. Now, Arthedain was one of the kingdoms, the three kingdoms that were once a larger kingdom called Arnor, which was once part of an even larger kingdom, the kingdom of Elendil. Elendil was from Numenor, and he colonized a large portion of Middle-earth. But after he died, it got broken into two parts. The north is Arnor, and the south is Gondor. And Arnor eventually got split into three separate realms, Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudain. And Tom Bombadil has made his little fiefdom where he stays in there in Arthedain, and at the border of it he said he would not go any further. But they were right within where they are coming to a place called Bree. Is the area just to the east of the Shire is called Breeland, and there's really not a lot of settlements there. There's one major settlement, which is Bree, and then there's a lot of like little shacks and shanty towns and things like that. There was once a great tower to the north of Bree called Formenos, which Formenos literally means North Tower in Elvish. There's a lot of very literal naming in Tolkien, because there are, in real life it's like that. Like there's a species of bear that is called horrible bear. It's in a few different languages. So it's like Latin and Greek. Horrible bear. So that's kind of funny. But like Belfalas is a place in Gondor to the south. It's where the Southern Havens were, and Bel and Falas both mean shoreline. So there you go. There's a lot of that kind of thing. So let's see. Oh, I think I've skipped ahead. Not that chapter. That's okay. Here we are. So we finished. We're at to chapter 9 of book 1. Of course, the Fellowship of the Ring is actually 2 books. A lot of people look at me funky when I say that, unfortunately. So I'll refer to book 2, and they think book 2 means the 2 towers. It doesn't. See, here it says book 1. But then about halfway through, after the chapter Flight to the Ford, you will see that it says book 2. And then shortly after that, well, the next page after that is the next chapter, Many Meetings, but it's chapter 1. See, Tolkien envisioned The Lord of the Rings as 1 book, not 3. And because of the time that it was being written and the time that it was being published, there were world wars, there were paper shortages, and his publisher told him it will have to be split up, and he thought it was going to be split into 6 parts. So that's why that's like that. All right. Chapter 9, At the Sign of the Prancing Pony. And of course, we will be stopping every once in a while to talk about it. So expect that as well. Bree was the chief village of the Bree land, a small inhabited region, like an island in the empty lands round about. Besides Bree itself, there was Straddle on the other side of the hill, Combe in a deep valley a little further eastward, and Archet on the edge of the Chetwood. Lying round Bree Hill and the villages was a small country of fields and tamed woodland only a few miles broad. The men of Bree were brown-haired, broad, and rather short, cheerful and independent. They belonged to nobody but themselves, but they were more friendly and familiar with hobbits, dwarves, elves, and other inhabitants of the world about them than was or is usual with big people. According to their own tales, they were the original... try that again. According to their own tales, they were the original inhabitants, and were the descendants of the first men that ever wandered into the west of the middle world. Few had survived the turmoils of the elder days, but when the king returned again over the great seas, they had found the Bree men still there, and they were still there now, but the memory of the old kings had faded into the grass. All right, I already have to stop and talk about this, because this is very interesting about the history of Bree. So what they're saying is that these men are descended from the original men that were indigenous to Middle-earth. And when they say that they've wandered into the west of the middle world, that's exactly what I'm going to do, actually. I'm glad you asked. What they're saying is that, so life came out of the east. That's where it's a place called Run, which in Elvish means east. Very, very simple naming there. And there was a place there called Cuivienen, which is the cradle of life, and that is where the elves, which were the first of the children of Iluvatar is God, awoke. There were 144 of them, and they spread out eastward into the rest of Middle-earth. And that was basically the beginning of what many people would consider to be the First Age, although the First Age calendar didn't start yet. It's a little confusing because the First Age is this really long period, but it's broken into these little calendars, the years of the lamps, the years of the trees, and then the First Age. But it's all actually the First Age. But when the sun first rose and the First Age calendar began, that's when mortal men first awoken. And they also came out of the east. Not out of Cuivienen. We never found out the exact name of the location that mortals first came out of, because the reason we know where the elves came from is because the elves wrote all the lore. And so they don't know where men came from, so we don't know where men came from. But we do know that it was the east. Now, the middle world, Middle-earth, basically whenever... Tolkien is really interesting because it's his fancy way of saying Midgard, which essentially means, it translates from Old Norse, Middle Yard, the dwelling of man, the place between the underworld and heaven. So that's what it means. Now, I think what we're seeing here is we're getting a little bit of a transition from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings, because if you read The Hobbit, they never mention Middle-earth, not even once. They don't even mention the Shire. But whenever they refer to Middle-earth, they call it the Wide World, which actually has its precedence in the Silmarillion, the Wide World, because Aemon, the Undying Lands, was the narrow land. And if we think of the shape of Middle-earth and the shape of the Undying Lands, it makes sense. If you have ever seen a map of Aemon, it's like a banana. Whereas Middle-earth is like Europe and Africa and Asia. Shaped slightly differently, but essentially Europe and Africa and Asia. So that's the wide world, but it's also Middle-earth, the dwelling of men. So we're seeing it, we're sort of transitioning from calling it the wide world to Middle-earth saying middle world. You see, book 1 is a very transitional book. It's where Tolkien is sort of coming out of this mode where he's writing The Hobbit Part 2 and going into this mode where he's writing one of the great tales that is a more detailed account of the final chapter of the Silmarillion. So it's like the final chapter of the Silmarillion is not very long. It's like 30 pages, and he's taking this idea into a 1,200-page book. So, there's a lot to say in just those first 2 paragraphs. This is why it's taking us so long to get through this book. In those days, no other men had settled dwellings so far west, or within 100 leagues of the Shire. But in the wild lands beyond Bree, they were mysterious wanderers. The Bree folk called them rangers, and knew nothing of their origin. They were taller and darker than the men of Bree, and were believed to have strange powers of sight and hearing, and to understand the languages of beasts and birds. They roamed at will southwards and eastwards, even as far as the misty mountains, but they were now few and rarely seen. When they appeared, they brought news from afar, and told strange forgotten tales, which were eagerly listened to. But the Bree folk did not make friends of them. Very brief pause here, just to say the description of rangers. Now, we don't really know much about rangers now. We're seeing them sort of through the lens of the way that the Bree folk look at them. But what we will come to understand is they are the Dunedain. They are the men of the West, or men of Westerness is a common way of saying it. They're from Numenor. Obviously, Numenor's gone. That's long gone. But these are the men that came from Numenor. And what's really interesting is it mentions right here, people really don't pick up on these things. They had dark skin. They were darker than the men of Bree. So, people get really weird about skin tones. I don't quite understand the fascination with it, but a lot of people will draw Aragorn, for example, with a darker skin tone, and people will say, that's not right. He's supposed to be very, very white. Not so much. Not so much. The most accurate depiction of Aragorn is, believe it or not, the Ralph Bakshi cartoon that came out in the 70s. He looked weird because he wasn't wearing pants, but it was a very accurate depiction of what Aragorn would look like and what he would sound like and what he would, move like even. They did a great job with Aragorn, not so much with other characters. There's a few... Ralph Bakshi had posted on Facebook and on Twitter about it, and The Lord of the Rings was on Adult Swim, and now you can stream it on Max, which is really cool. And I recommend, if you haven't seen this, it's incomplete, it's a bit of a mess, but there are great depictions of certain characters. Absolutely, Aragorn, Gandalf, Galadriel, they nailed those guys, like 100%. There were also many families of hobbits in the Bree land, and they claimed to be the oldest settlement of hobbits in the world, one that was founded long before even the Brandywine was crossed and the Shire colonized. They lived mostly in Staddle, though there were some in Bree itself, especially on the higher slopes of the hill away from the houses of men. The big folk and the little folk, as they called one another, were on friendly terms, minding their own affairs in their own ways, but both rightly regarding themselves as necessary parts of the Bree folk. Nowhere else in the world was this peculiar but excellent arrangement to be found. The Bree folk, big and little, did not themselves travel much, and the affairs of the 4 villages were their chief concern. Occasionally the hobbits of Bree went as far as Buckland, or the East Farthing. But though their little land was not much further than a day's riding east of the Brandywine Bridge, the hobbits of the Shire now seldom visited it. An occasional Bucklander or adventurous took would come out to the inn for a night or two, but even that was becoming less and less usual. The Shire hobbits referred to those of Bree and to any others that lived beyond the borders as outsiders, and took very little interest in them, considering them dull and uncouth. There were probably more outsiders scattered about the west of the world in those days than the people of the Shire imagined. Some, doubtless, were no better than tramps, ready to dig a hole in any bank and stay only as long as it suited them. But in the Bree land, at any rate, the hobbits were decent and prosperous, and no more rustic than most of their distant relatives inside. It was not yet forgotten that there had been a time when there was much coming and going between the Shire and Bree. There was Bree blood in the Brandybucks, by all account. And this is interesting. I know I'm pausing a lot, and I do apologize, but a lot of interesting things are being said here. It's mentioned specifically that the Brandybucks have at least some ancestry from Bree, and it is interesting that you'll notice that in a lot of the dealings here, when they first arrive, Merry does a lot of the talking for them. I've always said that Merry is sort of the leader at the early stage before Frodo sort of finds himself, you know? But anyway, there was something else to mention here. Oh, about that they're the oldest settlement of hobbits. So hobbits kind of come from all over the place. We don't know exactly where they first originated or what. I have a whole paper about my thoughts on the origins of hobbits that you could read on Quora. If you go to my Quora account and you click on my answers, there's one that's pinned. It's about the origins of hobbits. And it's not me saying that this is definitely what happened, but it is my theory backed up with months and months of research and a lot of cool pictures and such too. So definitely recommend, if you haven't read that, to check it out. But anyway, the reason I bring this up is because we know that at one point there were at least Stoors. There are three types of hobbits: Stoors, Fowlhides, and Harfoots. There were Stoors in the Vales of the Anduin, and well, Gandalf spoke about this in a previous chapter, and he made it seem like they were sort of prototypical Stoors, that they're from a long, long time ago. But he tells sort of the origin of Gollum, and it's only about 600 years ago. And what's interesting is that the Shire itself is much older than that. And Tolkien explained it in one of his letters, that what happened there is that Bree became the first place that hobbits settled down. They were a wandering folk before that. They were nomads, and they led this sort of migratory life. And then they found Bree, and they settled there, and they mixed with men. And then some of them went to the west of Bree, and they found this land that was untouched. It was part of Arthedain, but nobody had ever settled there other than, Tom Bombadil and his wife. And they went to the king of Arthedain, and they asked if they could settle this land as their own, and he said yes, of course. And that's where the Shire got founded. And hobbits started to pour in from all over the place, from Bree, from Dunland, from the Vales of the Anduin, from everywhere that they existed. They came to the Shire. Now, some of them didn't live in the Shire, obviously. They lived in places like Westmarch and Buckland and Bree. But this became basically the Hobbit part of Middle-earth. But there were some of them that didn't like it so much, and they went back to where they had come from, and that's where Gollum's people came from. The village of Bree had some 100 stone houses of the big folk, mostly above the road, nestling in the hillside with windows looking west. On that side, running in more than half a circle from the hill and back to it, there was a deep dike with a thick hedge of the inner side. Over this, the road crossed by a causeway, but where it pierced the hedge, it was barred by a great gate. There was another gate in the southern corner where the road ran out of the village. The gates were closed at nightfall, but just inside them were small lodges for the gatekeepers. Down on the road, where it swept to the right to go round the foot of the hill, there was a large inn. It had been built long ago, when the traffic on the roads had been far greater. For Bree stood at an old meeting of ways. Another ancient road crossed the east road just outside the dike at the western end of the village. And in former days, men and other folks of various sorts had travelled much on it. Strange as news from Bree was still a saying in the East Farthing, descending from those days when news from north, south, and east could be heard in the inn. But when the Shire hobbits used to go more often to go hear it, but the northern lands had long been desolate, and the north road was now seldom used. It was grass-grown, and the Bree folk called it the Greenway. The inn of Bree was still there, however, and the innkeeper was an important person. His house was a meeting place for the idle, talkative, and inquisitive among the inhabitants, large and small, of the 4 villages, and a resort of rangers and other wanderers, and for such travellers, mostly dwarves, as still journeyed on the east road to and from the mountains. It was dark, and white stars were shining, when Frodo and his companions came at last to the Greenway crossing and drew near the village. They came to the west gate and found it shut. But at the door of the lodge beyond it there was a man sitting. He jumped up and fetched a lantern, and looked over the gate at them in surprise. "What do you want, and where do you come from?" he asked gruffly. "We are making for the inn here," answered Frodo. "We are journeying east, and cannot go further tonight." "Hobbits! 4 hobbits! And what's more, out of the Shire by their talk," said the gatekeeper, softly, as if speaking to himself. He stared at them darkly for a moment, and then slowly opened the gate and let them ride through. "We don't often see Shire folk riding on the road at night," he went on, and they halted a moment by the door. "You'll pardon my wondering what business takes you away east of Bree. What may your name be, might I ask?" "Our names and our business are our own, and this does not seem a good place to discuss them," said Frodo, not liking the look of the man, or the tone of his voice. "Your business is your own, no doubt," said the man, "but it's my business to ask questions after nightfall. We are hobbits from Buckland, and we have a fancy to travel and to stay at the inn here," put in Merry. "I am Mr. Brandybuck. Is that enough for you? The Bree folk used to be fast-spoken to travellers, so I had heard." All right," said the man. "I meant no offence. But you'll find, maybe, that more folk than old Harry at the gate will be asking you questions. There's queer folk about. If you go out to the pony, you'll find you're not the only guests." He wished them good night, and they said no more, but Frodo could see in the lantern light that the man was still eyeing them curiously. He was glad to hear the gate clang to behind them as they rode forward. He wondered why the man was so suspicious, and whether anyone had been asking for news of a party of hobbits. Could it have been Gandalf? He might have arrived while they were delayed in the forest and the downs. But there was something in the look and the voice of the gatekeeper that made him uneasy. The man stared after the hobbits for a moment, and then he went back to his house. As soon as his back was turned, a dark figure climbed quickly in over the gate and melted into the shadows of the village street. So the dark figure is obviously one of the Nazgul, and we'll talk more about them later as they become more relevant. But I just want to point out, interestingly enough, that this is a scene in the film version of The Fellowship of the Ring, if you watch it, where as they're riding into Bree after the man, Harry, opens the gate, and there's this man standing in the road. It's actually raining in the scene, eating a carrot. That's actually Peter Jackson. I just wanted to point that out. The hobbits rode up on a gentle slope, passing a few detached houses, and drew up outside the inn. The houses looked large and strange to them. Sam stared up at the inn with its 3 stories and many windows, and felt his heart sink. He had imagined himself meeting giants taller than trees, and other creatures even more terrifying, some time or other in the course of his journey, but at the moment he was finding his first sight of men and their tall houses quite enough, indeed too much for the dark end of a tiring day. He pictured black horses standing all saddled in the shadows of the inn-yard, and black riders peering up out of dark upper windows. "We surely aren't going to stay here for the night, are we, sir?" he exclaimed. "If there are hobbit folk in these parts, why don't we look for some that would be willing to take us in? It would be more home-like." "What's wrong with the inn?" said Frodo. "Tom Bombadil recommended it. I expect it's home-like enough inside." Even from outside the inn looked a pleasant house to familiar eyes. It had a front on the road and 2 wings running back on land partly cut out of the lower slopes of the hill, so that the second-floor windows were level with the ground. There was a wide arch leading to a courtyard between the 2 wings, and on the left under the arch there was a large doorway, reached by a few broad steps. The door was open and light streamed out of it. Above the arch there was a lamp, and beneath it swung a large signboard. A fat white pony reared up on its high legs. Over the door was painted in white letters, "The Prancing Pony" by Barlam and Butterbur. Many of the lower windows showed lights behind thick curtains. I have to stop to drink water here. Peter Jackson is a carrot. Rated PG-13. You thought that too, yeah. Rated PG-13. As they hesitated outside in the gloom, someone began singing a merry song inside, and many cheerful voices joined loudly in the chorus. They listened to this encouraging sound for a moment, and then got off their ponies. The song ended, and there was a burst of laughter and clapping. They led their ponies under the arch, and leaving them standing in the yard, they climbed up the steps. Frodo went forward and nearly bumped into a short, fat man with a bald head and a red face. He had a white apron on, and was bustling out of one door and in through the other, carrying a tray laden with full mugs. "Can we—" began Frodo. "Half a minute, if you please," shouted the man over his shoulder, and vanished into a babble of voices and a cloud of smoke. In a moment he was out again, wiping his hands on his apron. "Good evening, little master," he said, bending down. "What may be you be wanting?" "Beds for 4, and stabling for 5 ponies, if that can be managed. Are you Mr. Butterbur?" "That's right. Barlaman is my name. Barlaman Butterbur at your service. You're from the Shire, eh?" he said, and then suddenly he clapped his hand to his forehead, as if trying to remember something. "Hobbits!" he cried. "Now what does that remind me of?" "Might I ask your names, sir?" "Mr. Took and Mr. Brandybuck," said Frodo, "and this is Sam Gamgee. My name is Underhill." "There now," said Mr. Butterbur, snapping his fingers. "It's gone again. But it'll come back when I have time to think. I'm run off my feet, but I'll see what I could do for you. We don't often get a party out of the Shire nowadays, and I should be sorry not to make you welcome. But there is such a crowd already in the house tonight as there hasn't been for long enough. It never rains, but it pours, we say in Bree. Hi, Nob, he shouted. Where are you, you willy-faced slowcoach? Nob! Coming, sir, coming. A cheery-looking hobbit bobbled out of the door, and seeing the travellers, stopped short and stared at them with great interest. "Where's Bob?" asked the landlord. "You don't know? Well, go find him, double sharp. I haven't got 6 legs nor 6 eyes neither. Tell Bob there's 5 ponies that have to be stabled. He must find room somehow." Nob trotted off with a grin and a wink. "Well, now, what was I going to say?" said Mr. Butterbur, tapping his forehead. "One thing drives out another, so to speak. I'm that busy tonight, my head is going round. There's a party that came up the Greenway from down south last night, and that was strange enough to begin with. Then there's a travelling company of dwarves going west come in this evening, and now there's you. If you weren't hobbits, I doubt we could house you, but we've got a room or 2 in the north wing that were made special for hobbits when this place was built. On the ground floor, as they usually prefer, round windows and all as they like it. I hope you'll be comfortable. You'll be wanting supper, I don't doubt it, and soon as may be. This way now." He led them a short way down the passage and opened a door. "Here is a nice little parlour," he said. "I hope it will suit. Excuse me now, I'm that busy. No time for talking. I must be trotting. It's hard work for 2 legs, but I don't get thinner. I'll look in again later. If you want anything, ring the handbell, and Nob will come. If he don't come, ring and shout." Off he went at last, and left them feeling rather breathless. He seemed capable of an endless stream of talk, however busy he might be. They found themselves in a small but cozy room. There was a bit of bright fire burning on the hearth, and in front of them were some low and comfortable chairs. There was a round table already spread with a white cloth, and on it was a large handbell. But Nob, the hobbit servant, came bustling in long before they thought of ringing. He brought candles and a tray full of plates. "Will you be wanting anything to drink, masters?" he asked. "And shall I show you the bedrooms while your supper is got ready?" They were washed in the middle of a good deep mugs of beer when Mr. Butterbur and Nob came in again. In a twinkling the table was laid. There was hot soup, cold meats, a blackberry tart, new loaves, slabs of butter, and half a ripe cheese. Good plain food, as good as the Shire could show, and homelike enough to dispel the last of Sam's misgivings, already much relieved by the excellence of the beer. The landlord hovered round a little, and then proposed to leave them. "I don't know whether you would care to join the company when you have supped," he said, standing at the door. "Perhaps you would rather go to your beds. Still, the company would be very pleased to welcome you if you have a mind. We don't get outsiders, travellers from the Shire, I should say, begging your pardon, often. And we'd like to hear a bit of news or any story or song you may have in mind, but as you please, ring the bell if you lack anything." So refreshed and encouraged did they feel at the end of their supper, about 3/4 of an hour already going, not hindered by unnecessary talk, that Frodo, Pippin, and Sam decided to join the company. Merry said it would be too stuffy. "I shall sit here quietly by the fire for a bit, and perhaps go out later for a sniff of air. Mind your P's and Q's, and don't forget that you're supposed to be escaping in secret, and still on the high road, and not very far from the Shire." "All right," said Pippin. "Mind yourself. Don't get lost, and don't forget that it's safer indoors." The company was in the big common room of the inn. The gathering was large and mixed, as Frodo discovered when his eyes got used to the light. This came chiefly from a blazing log fire, for the 3 lamps hanging from the beams were dim and half-veiled in smoke. Barlaman Butterbur was standing near the fire talking to a couple of dwarves and 1 or 2 strange-looking men. On the benches were various folk, men of Bree, a collection of local hobbits sitting chattering together, and a few more dwarves and other vague figures difficult to make out away in the shadows and corners. As soon as the Shire hobbits entered, there was a chorus of welcome from the Breelanders. The strangers, especially those who had come up the greenway, stared at them curiously. The landlord introduced the newcomers to the Bree folk so quickly that, though they caught many names, they were seldom sure whose names belonged to who. The men of Bree all seemed to have rather botanical, and to the Shire folk rather odd names, like Rushlight, Goatleaf, Heathertoes, Appledore, Thistlewall, and Ferny, not to mention Butterbur. Some of the hobbits had similar names. The Mugworts, for instance, seemed numerous. But most of them had natural names, such as Banks, Brockhouse, Longhole, Sandheaver, and Tunnelly, many of which were used in the Shire. There were several Underhills from Staddle, and as they could not imagine sharing a name without being related, they took Frodo to their hearts as a long-lost cousin. So I'm going to pause here and say, it's interesting because it's mentioned that in The Hobbit more than The Lord of the Rings, that hobbits are very meticulous about mapping out family trees and genealogies and figuring out who's related to whom and how closely they're related. And you might wonder why they do such a thing. And there are several reasons why they would. I think that part of it is because they're such an insular community, they have to make sure they're not marrying their own cousins. And another probably larger part of it is because they want to know whose birthday parties they can go to. And that's like the biggest thing, because they're all about free meals and gifts and such, like the Mathams, as they call them. And by the way, I'm not joking about the marrying cousins thing. That there's an app that you can get on your phone if you live in Iceland that actually, it's like a dating app. It actually tracks who you're related to and who you're not related to make sure you don't, accidentally wind up dating a cousin of some sort, because it's such an insular community that's a real danger that can happen. And the Shire hobbits have become so insular in the Third Age. But it's interesting that, there are Underhills here, and Frodo is using the assumed name Mr. Underhill, never a first name. So he's Frodo Underhill. And what's interesting about it is he didn't come up with that. Gandalf came up with it. He just said it off the top of his head, you'll be Mr. Underhill. But he imagined that he was going to be traveling with Frodo. Of course, he's cooped up in Isengard right now. But he imagined that he was going to be traveling with him, so if any kind of questionable, uncomfortable questions sort of came up, like, well, who's your dad? Who are you related to? How are you an Underhill? Thankfully, that didn't happen, but it could have. And it's a danger that you have when you run into somebody with the same last name who can't imagine not being related to you. And they might start to sort of poke holes in a story. And even though Frodo might put their minds at ease pretty easily, it's very possible, that, like say his mother could have married into the family or such. But this could attract attention from some of these other people. Now, it's mentioned that they're being eyed by people that came up the other road. There was the road that goes east and west. And that's the road that basically starts in the Shire and goes right through the Misty Mountains and even into Mirkwood. But there's another road that comes up from the south, and it used to go up to Formenos. The dwarves still get up there. The Blue Mountains are not far away. But what's interesting is we're already being told about the strange party from the south. And we're going to hear a lot about this, the Southerners, the Southrons, that they're sort of weird and they're sort of looking at the hobbits suspiciously. And what Tolkien is doing here is really, really brilliant, because we're in book 1, and he's already setting up a major part of book 6, which is the Scouring of the Shire. And in the Scouring of the Shire is when they come home and they discover that the Shire has been befouled, and they must scour it. Scour means to clean, in a rough sort of manner, and sort of a metaphor for just cleaning out all the undesirables. And we learn that a lot of these sort of shifty-eyed men, half-orcs, some of them, were actually working for Saruman. And they're actually on the lookout for the ring bearer. So Frodo's in a lot of danger here, and he doesn't even realize it yet. The company was in the big common room of the inn. The gathering was large and mixed, as Frodo discovered when I already read that part. I'm sorry, I backed up there. Let's here we are. The Bree hobbits were in fact friendly and inquisitive, and Frodo soon found that some explanation of what he was doing would have to be given. He gave out that he was interested in history and geography, at which there was much wagging of heads, although neither of these words were much used in the Bree dialect. He said he was thinking of writing a book, at which there was silent astonishment, and that he and his friends wanted to collect information about hobbits living outside the Shire, especially in the eastern lands. At this a chorus of voices broke out. If Frodo had really wanted to write a book, and had many ears, he would have learned enough for several chapters in a few minutes. And if that was not enough, he was given a whole list of names, beginning with old Barlaman here, to whom he could go to for further information. But after a time, as Frodo did not show any sign of writing a book on the spot, the hobbits returned to their questions about doings in the Shire. Frodo did not prove very communicative, and soon found himself sitting alone in a corner listening and looking around. The men and dwarves were mostly talking of distant events and telling news of a kind that was becoming only too familiar. There was trouble away in the south, and it seemed that the men who had come up the Greenway were on the move, looking for lands where they could find some peace. The Bree folk were sympathetic, but plainly not very ready to take a large number of strangers into their little land. One of the travelers, a squint-eyed, ill-favored fellow, was foretelling that there were more and more people would be coming north in the near future. If room isn't found for them, then they'll find it themselves. They've got a right to live, same as other folk, he said loudly. The local inhabitants did not look pleased at this prospect. The hobbits did not pay much attention to all this, and it did not at the moment seem to concern hobbits. Big folk could hardly beg for lodgings in hobbit holes. They were more interested in Sam and Pippin, who were now feeling quite at home and were chatting gaily about events in the Shire. Pippin roused a good deal of laughter with an account of the collapse of the roof of the town hall in Meikledelving. Will Whitfoot, the mayor, and the fattest hobbit in the West Farthing had been buried in chalk and came out like a flour dumpling. But there were several questions asked that made Frodo a little uneasy. One of the Breelanders, who seemed to have been in the Shire several times, wanted to know where the Underhills lived and who they were related to. Suddenly Frodo noticed that a strange-looking, weather-beaten man, sitting in the shadows near the wall, was also listening intently to the hobbit talk. He had a tall tankard in front of him, and was smoking a long-stemmed pipe curiously carved. His legs were stretched out before him, showing high boots of supple leather that fitted him well, but had seen much wear and were now caked with mud. A travel-stained cloak of heavy dark green cloth was drawn close about him, and in spite of the heat of the room, he wore a hood that overshadowed his face, but the gleam of his eyes could be seen as they watched over the hobbits. Sometimes I get ahead of myself there. Our first description of Aragorn, or at least of what he's wearing. There was something that I wanted to mention here. What was it? Perhaps it'll come back to me. Oh well, I digress. Let's continue. "Who is that?" Frodo asked when he got a chance to whisper to Mr. Butterbur. "I don't think you introduced him." "Him," said the landlord in an answering whisper, cocking an eye without turning his head. "I don't rightly know. He's one of the wandering folk. Rangers, we call them. He seldom talks. Not but what he can't tell a rare tale when he has his mind. He disappears for a month or a year, and then he pops up again. He was in and out pretty often last spring, but I haven't seen him about lately. What his right name is, I haven't heard, but he's known round here as Strider. Goes about a great pace on his long shanks, though he don't tell nobody what cause he has to hurry. But there's no accounting for east and west, as we say in Bree, meaning the Rangers and the Shire folk, begging your pardon. Funny you should ask about him." But at that moment Mr. Butterbur was called away by a demand for more ale, and his last remark remained unexplained. Frodo found that Strider was now looking at him as if he had heard or guessed all that had been said. Presently, with a wave of his hand and a nod, he invited Frodo to come over and sit by him. As Frodo drew near, he threw back his hood, showing a shaggy head of dark hair flecked with grey, and in a pale, stern face a pair of keen grey eyes. "I am called Strider," he said in a low voice. "I am very pleased to meet you, Master Underhill, if old Butterbur got your name right." "He did," said Frodo stiffly. He felt far from comfortable under the stare of those keen eyes. "Well, Master Underhill," said Strider, "if I were you, I should stop your young friends from talking too much. Drink, fire, and chance meeting are pleasant enough, but, well, this isn't the Shire. There are queer folk about. Though I say it as I shouldn't, you may think," he added with a wry smile, seeing Frodo's glance. "And there have been even stranger travellers through Bree lately," he went on, watching Frodo's face. Frodo returned his gaze, but said nothing, and Strider made no further sign. His attention seemed suddenly to be fixed on Pippin. To his alarm, Frodo became aware that this ridiculous young Took, encouraged by his success with the fat mayor of Michedelving, was now actually giving a comic account of Bilbo's farewell party. He was already giving an imitation of the speech, and was drawing near to the astonishing disappearance. Frodo was annoyed. It was a harmless enough tale for most of the local hobbits, no doubt. Just a funny story about those funny people away beyond the river. But some, old Butterbur, for instance, knew a thing or two, and had probably heard rumors long ago about Bilbo's vanishing. It would bring the name of Baggins to their mind, especially if there had been inquiries in Bree after that name. Frodo fidgeted, wondering what to do. Pippin was evidently much enjoying the attention he was getting, and had become quite forgetful of their danger. Frodo had a sudden fear that in his present mood he might even mention the ring, and that might well be disastrous. "You had better do something quick," whispered Strider in his ear. Frodo jumped up and stood on a table and began to talk. The attention of Pippin's audience was disturbed. Some of the hobbits looked at Frodo and laughed and clapped, thinking that Mr. Underhill had taken as much ale as was good for him. Frodo suddenly felt very foolish and found himself, as was his habit when making a speech, fingering the things in his pocket. He felt the ring on its chain, and quite unaccountably the desire came over him to slip it on and vanish out of the silly situation. It seemed to him somehow as if the suggestion came to him from outside, from someone or something in the room. He resisted the temptation firmly, and clasped the ring in his hand as if to keep hold on it and prevent it from escaping or doing any mischief. At any rate, it gave him no inspiration. He spoke a few suitable words, as they would have said in the Shire. "We're all very much grateful by the kindness of your reception, and I venture to hope that my brief visit will help to renew the old ties of friendship between the Shire and Bree." And then he hesitated and coughed. Before I continue here, I want to mention that Frodo is not just tempting to put on the ring here because he's embarrassed. He went and stood on the table and started speaking without thinking of what he was going to be speaking, and of course drew everybody's attention to him. And now he's feeling like that dream you may have where you're at your old high school and you've forgotten your pants, you know. So he's embarrassed, obviously, but he's feeling the urge from outside, or perhaps even from somebody in the room, compelling him to put on the ring. And we've already seen this as they traveled out of the Shire, or well, it was still within the Shire, but out of Crick Hollow, or towards Crick Hollow, I should say. This is between Hobbiton and Crick Hollow, when we first encountered the Black Riders, as they're being called right now, the Nazgul, the Ring Wraiths. That they can put out this sort of spell, this aura, to compel Frodo to wear the ring. Now, Peter Jackson interpreted all of this as that they can sense the ring, and that they're drawn to it. And if he puts it on, they're even more drawn to it. That's not so much the case in the book. It's a little bit more complicated, but the Black Riders, the Nazgul, they are mortal men. And they put on rings of power a long time ago, and they basically became ensnared by necromancy. And through the power of the One Ring, they are permanently bound to their rings, and their rings are permanently bound to the One Ring, and so they cannot die. Their bodies are long gone. Their bodies died, withered away to nothing. There's nothing left. They're like ghosts, but they're still anchored to the world. They cannot accept the gift of man and leave the world and go out into the void and be with Iluvatar. They have to stay here because of Sauron. And they're in sort of I guess you would say a parallel dimension of sorts. Tolkien called it the Wraith World. And the Wraith World is sort of dark and blurry. and they see living people as dark and blurry. But if somebody puts on the ring, they're being drawn into the Wraith world. And that's why they turn invisible. It's not the function of the One Ring to make somebody invisible. The function of the One Ring is to dominate the wills of others. And it was made for Sauron. But when somebody puts on the ring, they essentially briefly become sort of like a spirit. And because of this, they cannot be seen because people can't really see spirits. They still have form, just like the Wraiths still have form. Frodo can pick up objects and manipulate them. He could touch people, and the people could feel themselves being touched. The Ring Wraiths also have form. They could wear cloaks. They could wield weapons. They could ride horses. They're not exactly ghosts. They're called Wraiths, but they're not exactly ghosts. They're just fully in the Wraith world. But when Frodo goes into their world, he's able to see them clearly, and they're able to see him clearly. So, according to Sauron, who's getting this information from Gollum, the ring is being held by a hobbit, which is a halfling, so short, by the name of Baggins. Now, what Sauron's thinking of Bilbo. Bilbo doesn't have the ring anymore, but unfortunately it has passed to another hobbit named Baggins, so Frodo is in just as much danger as Bilbo would have been. And the thing is, when you see 4 of them like this, and I remember what I was going to say earlier, and I'll append that to the end of this. It's about Aragorn. When you have 4 of them, and they're sort of blurry and dark, and you can't really see their features, the Ring Wraiths, they don't know which one is the ring bearer, and they're not really interested in all of them. They just want the one that has the ring. And they, you might think, well, why don't they just kill them all and then find the ring? Because Sauron doesn't want that. Sauron doesn't want the ring bearer killed. He wants the ring bearer brought to Mordor to be tortured by him personally. So they're under orders to bring the ring bearer to Mordor alive. And so they could compel him to want to put on the ring. And we know that they're in town. At least some of them are in town, because we heard of, as the gate was closing, this dark figure slipped in to Bree. And Merry is out there, so he's in danger because he's walking out and getting some fresh air. Now, the thing that I was going to talk about earlier that I neglected to is in the early writings, before this became this grand tale that is a part of the Silmarillion and everything, when it was just the sequel to The Hobbit, Tolkien was writing about, just this adventure of 6 hobbits. And Frodo wasn't even called Frodo at this point. He was actually called Bingo. He was Bingo Baggins. And Sam was there, and Merry and Pippin, as well as Fatty Bulger, who wound up traveling with them. And the 6th one was called Trotter. And you can see the connection between Trotter and Strider. So Aragorn, Strider, he actually didn't even start out as a man. Like, the idea that he would be the king and all this came later. Originally, he was just a very well-traveled hobbit that they called Trotter. Tolkien even played with the idea that he had walked so much that he wore his feet down to the nubs and had to get artificial feet. You could see that's a very hobbit sort of idea. Not very much a Lord of the Rings sort of idea. So that was dropped. Everyone in the room was now looking at him. "A song!" shouted one of the hobbits. "A song! A song!" shouted all the others. "Come on now, master, sing us something that we haven't heard before." For a moment Frodo stood gaping. Then in desperation he began a ridiculous song that Bilbo had been rather fond of, and indeed rather proud of, for he had made up the words himself. It was about an inn, and that is probably why it came to Frodo's mind just then. Here it is in full. Only a few words of it are now, as a rule, remembered. "There is an inn, a merry old inn, beneath a old grey hill. And there they brew a beer so brown that the man in the moon himself came down one night to drink his fill. The ostler has a tipsy cat that plays a 5-stringed fiddle, and up and down he runs his bow, now squeaking high, now purring low, now sawing in the middle. The landlord keeps a little dog that is mighty fond of jokes, but when there's good cheer among the guests he cocks an ear at all the jests and laughs until he chokes. They also keep a horned cow, as proud as any queen, but music turns her head like ale, and makes her wave her tufted tail, and dance upon the green. And oh, the rows of silver dishes, and the store of silver spoons, for Sunday there's a special pair, and there they polish up with care on Saturday afternoons. The man in the moon was drinking deep, and the cat began to wail. A dish and a spoon on the table danced, a cow in the garden madly pranced, and the little dog chased his tail. The man in the moon took another mug, and then rolled beneath his chair, and there he dozed and dreamed of ale, till the sky the stars were pale, and dawn was in the air. Then the ostler said to his tipsy cat, the white horses of the moon, they neigh and champ at their silver bits, but their master's been drowned in his wits, and the sun'll be rising soon. So the cat on his fiddle played hey diddle diddle, a jig that would wake the dead. He squeaked and sawed and quickened the tune, while the landlord shook the man in the moon. It's after 3, he said. They rolled the man slowly up the hill, and bundled him into the moon, while his horses galloped up in rear, and the cow came capering like a deer, and at the dish ran up with the spoon. Now quicker the fiddle went diddle-dum-diddle, the dog began to roar, the cow and horses stood on their heads, the guests all bounded from their beds, and danced upon the floor. With a ping and a pong the fiddle strings broke, the cow jumped over the moon, and the little dog laughed to see such fun, and the Saturday dish went up into the run with the silver Sunday spoon. The round moon rolled down the hill, as the sun raised up her head. She hardly believed her fiery eyes, for though it was day, to her surprise, they all went back to bed. There's a lot to talk about there, with this absolutely ridiculous song that Frodo sings. So, parts of it are familiar. As a child, you may have heard, hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the man jumped over the moon and all that stuff, right? And Tolkien is sort of putting in this cute little line saying, only a little bit of the song is known now, a lot of it's forgotten, but Bilbo wrote it. So it's interesting to think of this little nursery rhyme that you may have heard when you were small, had its origin in this mythical past a long, long time ago, in Middle-earth. That it was just something that Bilbo came up with about there being a man in the moon, and he comes down and he gets really, really drunk, and then all hell breaks loose. But here's what's another interesting part, and there's actually a note here. There's a little asterisk on the 3rd line of the final stanza. She hardly believed her fiery eyes, referring to the sun. And there's a footnote here that says, elves and hobbits always refer to the sun as she. No further explanation given. But believe it or not, in Middle-earth lore, there is a man in the moon, and the sun is a woman of sorts. So, not really a man, but an angel, a Maya, like Gandalf, like Sauron. The sun and the moon are not in this world what we know them as. The moon, of course, we know it. It's a giant rock. It's a satellite of ours that orbits us. And the sun is a star that we orbit. It's really, really far away. But that's not true in terms of what's happening here in The Lord of the Rings. Middle-earth was once lit by 2 giant lamps on top of 2 giant towers. And Melkor, who's essentially Satan, broke them, destroyed them, and cast Middle-earth into darkness. And so Varda, she's the queen of the angels. She created the stars so that there would be a night sky so that you could see. And the children of Iluvatar, the elves and eventually the men, would awaken to starlight. And that's why elves and starlight are actually very, very interconnected. The word elf in universe is derived from Eldar, which means of the stars. El means star. So, why am I talking about this? So, after the War of the Valar, where all of the Valar fought Melkor, and they all sort of absconded out of Middle-earth, and they went to the Undying Lands, and Yavanna created the 2 trees, Laurelin the gold and Telperion the silver. And they were the way that they were able to tell time, because one would wax and the other would wane, and then that one would wane and the other one would wax. And one was gold, and the other was silver. So when Laurelin the gold was very, very bright, it was like daytime, and when Telperion the silver was bright, it was more like nighttime. And the elves liked Telperion because it was like starlight to them. But anyway, Melkor came again, and he destroyed the 2 trees. He came with a giant spider demon called Ungoliant, and he plunged a spear into the trees. And he did this at a time when there was a big feast going on, and all the elves and all the angels were gathered for this big party. And he plunged a spear into it, and all of the light, the sap, came gushing out of the trees, and Ungoliant came in and drank it all up and destroyed the trees. And then they ran off to Middle-earth. And then, the Silmarillion happens. But anyway, the reason I bring this up is they were able to save 1 flower from Telperion the silver and 1 fruit of Laurelin the gold. And these were very, very bright objects. And Aula, he's the craftsman of the angels. He put them into these vessels, and he gave them to 2 of the Maya. The Vala are like the greater angels, and the Maya are the lesser angels. And the flower of Telperion was given to a Maya by the name of Tilion. And Tilion would go soaring through the sky with this flower, and that's the moon. So Tilion is essentially the man in the moon. And the fruit of Laurelin the gold was given to a Maya named Arian. And Arian was she was a spirit of fire. She was said to be so beautiful and so radiant that it was hard to look at her. You would almost go blind. And she's the sun. So, referring to the sun as a woman and referring to there being a man in the moon in this silly, ridiculous song, it was made up by Bilbo, and Bilbo made a lot of crazy poems and songs that had their roots in elvish lore. He wrote a poem called Errantry, which you can find in the book The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. And an errantry is about a man going out and fighting, giant bumblebees and all this crazy stuff. And the idea was that during The Hobbit, when he stayed in Rivendell, a lot of the elves there told him their tales of the First Age, and he didn't realize at this point that these were real things that really happened. He thought they were just fairy tales, and he sort of made up his own version of them. And of course, later he came to realize that this all really happened because he was the one that translated the Silmarillion and brought it to a wider audience in Middle-earth. But yeah, even in that ridiculous song that Frodo sings just because he can't think of anything else, and he's in an inn, so it's about the moon getting drunk at an inn, and everybody's sleeping during the day because they had too much ale, and all this crazy stuff. That's where that comes from. There was long and loud applause. Frodo had a good voice, and the song tickled their fancy. "Where's old Barley?" they cried. "He ought to hear this. Bob ought to learn his cat the fiddle, and then we'd have a dance." They called for more ale and began to shout, "Let's have it again, master. Come on now, once more." They made Frodo have another drink, and then begin his song again, while many of them joined in, for the tune was well known, and they were quick at picking up words. It was now Frodo's turn to feel pleased with himself. He capered around on the table, and when it came a second time to "The Cow Jumped Over the Moon," he leaped in the air, much too vigorously, for he came down, bang, into a tray full of mugs and slipped, and rolled off the table with a crash, clatter, and bump. The audience all opened their mouths wide for laughter and stopped short in gaping silence, for the singer disappeared. He simply vanished, as if he had gone slap through the floor without leaving a hole. The local hobbits stared in amazement, and then sprang to their feet and shouted for Barlaman. All the company drew away from Pippin and Sam, who found themselves alone in a corner, and eyed darkly and doubtfully from a distance. It was plain that many people regarded them now as the companions of a traveling magician of unknown powers and purpose. But there was one swarthy Breelander who stood looking at them with a knowing and half-mocking expression that made them feel very uncomfortable. Presently he slipped out of the door, followed by the squint-eyed southerner. The two had been whispering together a good deal during the evening, Harry the gatekeeper also went out just behind them. Frodo felt a fool. Not knowing what else to do, he crawled away under the tables to the dark corner by Strider, who sat unmoved, giving no sign of his thoughts. Frodo leaned back against the wall and took off the ring. How it came to be on his finger he could not tell. He could only suppose that he had been handling it in his pocket while he sang, and that somehow it had slipped on when he stuck his hand with a jerk to save his fall. For a moment he wondered if the ring itself had not played him a trick. Perhaps it had tried to reveal itself in response to some wish or command that was felt in the room. He did not like the looks of the men who had gone out. "Well," said Strider when he reappeared, "why did you do that? Worse than anything your friends could have said. You've put your foot in it, or should I say your finger?" "I don't know what you mean," said Frodo, annoyed and alarmed. "Oh, guess you do," answered Strider. "But we had better wait until the uproar has died down. Then, if you please, Mr. Baggins, I would like a quick word with you." "What about?" asked Frodo, ignoring the sudden use of his proper name. "A matter of some importance to us both," answered Strider, looking Frodo in the eye. "You may hear something to your advantage." "Very well," said Frodo, trying to appear unconcerned. "I'll talk to you later." Meanwhile, an argument was going on by the fireplace. Mr. Butterbur had come trotting in and was now trying to listen to several conflicting accounts of the event at the same time. "I saw him, Mr. Butterbur," said a hobbit, "or leastways I didn't see him, if you take my meaning. He just vanished into thin air, in a manner of speaking." "You don't say, Mr. Mugwort," said the landlord, looking puzzled. "Yes, I do," replied Mugwort, "and I mean what I say, what's more." "There's some mistake somewhere," said Butterbur, shaking his head. "There was too much of that Mr. Underhill to go vanishing into thin air or into thick air, as is more likely in this room." "Well, where is he now?" cried several voices. "How should I know? He's welcome to go where he will, as long as he pays in the morning. There's Mr. Took now, he's not vanished." "Well, I saw what I saw, and I saw what I didn't," said Mugwort obstinately. "And I say there's some mistake," repeated Butterbur, picking up the tray and gathering the broken crockery. "Of course there's a mistake," said Frodo. "I haven't vanished. Here I am. I've just been having a few words with Strider in the corner." He came forward into the firelight, but most of the company backed away, even more perturbed than before. They were not in the least satisfied by his explanation that he had crawled away quickly under the tables after he had fallen. Most of the hobbits and the men of Bree went off then, and there was a huff, having no fancy for further entertainment that evening. One or two gave Frodo a black look and departed, muttering among themselves. The dwarves and 2 or 3 strange men that still remained got up and said good night to the landlord, but not to Frodo and his friends. Before long no one was left but Strider, who sat on unnoticed by the wall. Mr. Butterbur did not seem much put out. He'd reckoned very probably that his house would be full again on many future nights, until the present mystery had been thoroughly discussed. "Now, what have you been doing, Mr. Underhill?" he asked. "Frightening my customers and breaking up my crocks with your acrobatics?" "I'm very sorry to have caused you any trouble," said Frodo. "It was quite unintentional, I assure you. A most unfortunate accident." "All right, Mr. Underhill, but if you're going to do any more tumbling or conjuring or whatever it was, you'd best warn folk beforehand, and warn me. We're a bit suspicious round here of anything out of the way, uncanny, if you understand me, and we don't take to it all of a sudden. I shan't be doing anything of the sort again, Mr. Butterbur, I promise you. And now I think I'll be getting to bed. We shall be making an early start. Will you see that our ponies are ready by 8 o'clock? Very good. But before you go, I should like a word with you in private, Mr. Underhill. Something has just come back to my mind that I ought to tell you. I hope you'll not take it amiss. When I've been seen to a thing or two, I'll come along to your room if you're willing." "Certainly," said Frodo, but his heart sank. He wondered how many private talks he would have to have before he got to bed, and what they would reveal. Were these people all in league against him? He began to suspect even old Butterbur's fat face of concealing dark designs. So I mentioned earlier, that's the end of the chapter there, that, the gateman, Harry, he's shifty, and that these guys all sort of work for Saruman. But some of them work for Saruman. Some of them are clearly working for Sauron, and some of them are going to fetch the Nazgul, as we know. So we're going to get into chapter 10 here, which is Strider. Let's see, is this a very long chapter? I'm trying to gauge how much we could get to today. I had a lot to say about At the Sign of the Prancing Pony. But I think we can get through Strider pretty easily. Chapter 10, Strider. Frodo, Pippin, and Sam made their way back to the parlor. There was no light. Merry was not there, and the fire had burned low. It was not until they had puffed up the embers into a blaze and thrown on a couple of bundles that they discovered Strider had come with them. Then he was calmly sitting in a chair by the door. And I changed one of the words there, for good reason, because it's Twitch. "Hello," said Pippin. "Who are you, and what do you want?" "I am called Strider," he answered. "And though he may have forgotten it, your friend promised to have a quiet talk with me." "You said I might hear something to my advantage, I believe," said Frodo. "What have you to say?" "Several things," answered Strider, "but of course I have my price." "What do you mean?" asked Frodo sharply. "Don't be alarmed." "I mean just this. I will tell you what I know, and give you some good advice, but I shall want a reward." "And what will that be, pray?" said Frodo. He suspected now that he had fallen in with a rascal, and he thought uncomfortably that he had brought only a little money with him. All of it would hardly satisfy a rogue, and he could not spare any of it. "No more than you could afford," answered Strider with a slow smile, as if he guessed Frodo's thoughts. "Just this. You must take me along with you until I wish to leave you." "Oh, indeed," replied Frodo, surprised, but not much relieved. "Even if I wanted another companion, I should not agree to any such thing until I knew a good deal more about you and your business." "Excellent!" exclaimed Strider, crossing his legs and sitting back comfortably. "You seem to be coming to your senses again, and that is all to the good. You have been much too careless so far. Very well, I will tell you what I know and leave the reward to you. You may be glad to grant it when you have heard me." "Go on, then," said Frodo. "What do you know?" "Too much. Too many dark things," said Strider grimly. "But as for your business—" He got up and went to the door, opened it quickly and looked out. Then he shut it quietly and sat down again. "I have quick ears," he went on, lowering his voice. "And though I cannot disappear, I have hunted many wild and wary things, and I could usually avoid being seen if I wish. Now, I was behind the hedge this evening on the road west of Bree, when 4 hobbits came out of the downlands. I need not repeat all they said to old Bombadil, or to one another. But one thing interested me. 'Please remember,' said one of them, 'that the name of Baggins must not be mentioned. I am Mr. Underhill if any name must be given.' That interested me so much that I followed them there. I slipped over the gate just behind them. Maybe Mr. Baggins has an honest reason for giving his name behind. But if so, I should advise him and his friends to be more careful." "I don't see what interest my name has for anyone in Bree," said Frodo angrily. "And I have still to learn why it interests you, Mr. Strider. May have an honest reason for spying and eavesdropping, but if so, I should advise him to explain it." "Well answered," said Strider, laughing. "Well, the explanation is simple. I was looking for a hobbit called Frodo Baggins. I wanted to find him quickly. I had learned that he was carrying out of the Shire, a secret that concerned me and my friends. Now don't mistake me," he cried, as Frodo rose from his seat and Sam jumped up with a scowl. "I shall take more care of the secret than you do, and care is needed." He leaned forward and looked at them. "Watch every shadow," he said in a low voice. "Black horsemen have passed through Bree. On Monday one came down the Greenway, they say, and another appeared later, coming up the Greenway from the south." There was a silence. At last Frodo spoke to Pippin and Sam. "I ought to have guessed it from the way the gatekeeper greeted us," he said. "And the landlord seems to have heard something. Why did he press us to join the company? And why on earth did we behave so foolishly? We ought to have stayed quiet in here." "It would have been better," said Strider. "I would have stopped your going into the common room if I could, but the innkeeper would not let me in to see you, or take a message." "Do you think he—" began Frodo. "No, I don't think any harm of old Butterbur. Only he does not altogether like mysterious vagabonds of my sort." Frodo gave him a puzzled look. "Well, I have rather a rascally look, have I not?" said Strider with a curl of his lip and a queer gleam in his eye. "But I hope we shall get to know one another better. When we do, I hope you will explain what happened at the end of your song, for that little prank—" "It was sheer accident," interrupted Frodo. "I wonder," said Strider. "Accident, then. That accident has made your position dangerous." "Hardly more than it is already," said Frodo. "I know those horsemen were pursuing me, but now at any rate they seem to have missed me and to have gone away." "You must not count on that," said Strider sharply. "They will return, and more are coming. There are others. I know their number. I know these riders." He paused, and his eyes were cold and hard. "And there are some folk in Bree who are not to be trusted," he went on. "Bill Ferny, for instance. He has an evil name in Bree land, and queer folk call at his house." You must have noticed him among the company, a swarthy, sneering fellow. He was very close with one of the southern strangers, as they slipped off together just after your accident. Not all of these southerners mean well. And as for Fernie, he would sell anything to anybody or make mischief for amusement. What will Fernie sell? And what has my accident got to do with him? Said Frodo, still determined not to understand Strider's hints. News of you, of course, answered Strider. An account of your performance would be very interesting to certain people. After that, they would hardly need to be told your real name. It seems to me only too likely that they will hear of it again before this night is over. Is that enough? You can do as you like about my reward, take me as a guide or not. But I may say that I know all the lands between the Shire and the Misty Mountains, for I have wandered over them for many years. I am older than I look. I might prove useful. You will have to leave the open road after tonight, for the horsemen will watch it night and day. You may escape from Bree and be allowed to go forward while the sun is up, but you won't go far. They will come for you in the wild, in some dark place, where there is no help. Do you wish them to find you? They are terrible. The hobbits looked at him and saw with surprise that his face was drawn, as if with pain, and his hands clenched the arms of his chair. The room was very quiet and still, and the light seemed to have grown dim. For a while he sat with unseeing eyes, as if walking in distant memory, or listening to sounds in the night far away. I have to pause for water here. There, he cried after a moment, drawing his hand across his brow. Perhaps I know more about these pursuers than you do. You fear them, but you do not fear them enough yet. Tomorrow you will have to escape if you can. Strider can take you by paths that are seldom trodden. Will you have him? There was a heavy silence. Frodo made no answer. His mind was confused with doubt and fear. Sam frowned and looked at his master, and at last he broke out. With your leave, Mr. Frodo, I'd say no. This Strider here, he warns and he says take care, and I say yes to that. And let's begin with him. He comes out of the wild, and I never heard no good of such folk. He knows something, that's plain, and more than I like, but it's no reason why we should let him go leading us into some dark place far from help, as he puts it. Pippin fidgeted and looked uncomfortable. Strider did not reply to Sam, but turned his keen eyes on Frodo. Frodo caught his glance and looked away. No, he said slowly, I don't agree. I think that you are not really as you choose to look. You began to talk to me like the Bree folk, but your voice has changed. Still, Sam seems right in this. I don't see why you should warn us to take care, and yet ask us to take you on trust. Why the disguise? Who are you? What do you really know about my business? And how do you know it? The lesson in caution has been well learned, said Strider with a grim smile. But caution is one thing and wavering is another. You will never get to Rivendell now on your own. And to trust me is your only chance. You must make up your mind. I will answer some of your questions if that will help you do so. But why should you believe my story if you do not trust me already? Still, here it is. At that moment there came a knock at the door. Mr. Butterbur had arrived with candles, and behind them was Nob with cans of hot water. Strider withdrew into a dark corner. I've come to bid you good night, said the landlord, putting the candles on the table. Nob, take the water to the rooms. He came in and shut the door. It's like this, he began, hesitating and looking around, troubled. If I've done any harm, I'm sorry indeed, but one thing drives out another, as you'll admit, and I'm a busy man. But first one thing, and then another this week have jogged my memory, as the saying goes, and not too late, I hope. You see, I was asked to look out for hobbits of the Shire, and for one by the name of Baggins in particular. And what has that got to do with me? Asked Frodo. Ah, you know best, said the landlord knowingly. I won't give you away, but I was told that this Baggins would be going by the name of Underhill, and I was given a description that fits you well enough, if I may say so. Indeed, let's have it then, said Frodo, unwisely interrupting. A stout little fellow with red cheeks, said Mr. Butterbur solemnly. Pippin chuckled, but Sam looked indignant. That won't help you much. It goes for most hobbits, Barley, he says to me, continued Mr. Butterbur with a glance at Pippin. But this one is taller than some and fairer than most, and he has a cleft in his chin. Perky chap with a bright eye. Begging your pardon, but he said it, not me. He said it? And who was he? Asked Frodo eagerly. Ah, that was Gandalf, if you know who I mean. A wizard, they say he is, but he's a good friend of mine, whether or no. But now I don't know what he'll have to say to me if I see him again, turn all my ale sour, or turned me into a block of wood, I shouldn't wonder. He's a bit hasty. Still, what's done can't be undone. Well, what have you done? Said Frodo, getting impatient with the slow unravelling of Butterbur's thoughts. Where was I? Said the landlord, pausing and snapping his fingers. Yes, old Gandalf. 3 months back, he walked right into my room without a knock. Barley, he says, I'm off in the morning. Will you do something for me? You've only to name it, I said. I'm in a hurry, says he, and I have no time to myself, but I want a message took to the Shire. Have you anyone you can send or trust to go? I can find someone, I says, tomorrow, maybe, or the day after. Make it tomorrow, he says, and then he gave me a letter. It's addressed plain enough, said Mr. Butterbur, producing a letter from his pocket and reading out the address slowly and proudly. He valued his reputation as a lettered man. Mr. Frodo Baggins, Bag End Hobbiton in the Shire. I just want to pause here. There was a curious phrase used there, right there, where it said that he valued his reputation as a lettered man. You might wonder what that means. That means that he's literate, that he is able to both read and write. He knows his letters. That's the phrase often used in The Lord of the Rings. And we get the idea from the talk in the Green Dragon Inn in Bywater in the beginning of the book, and from this right here, that literacy is not super common in this part of the world. Frodo can read and write. He is basically an aristocrat, and he was raised by Bilbo, who is very, very educated. Merry and Pippin are also aristocracy. The Tooks and the Brandybucks, very large families, very important. Merry is said to become the next master of Brandy Hall, which would essentially make him the political power in Buckland. So Merry is essentially the next in line to be in charge of Buckland. Well, Pippin, his father is the Thane of the Shire. The Shire has two political leaders. There's the mayor of Meikle Delving, which is Will Whitfoot. He was mentioned a little while ago. And there's the Thane. The Thane is more of a war leader, which is in these days more of a ceremonial title because the Shire doesn't really go to war. But the Thane is Pippin's father, and Pippin will become the next Thane at some point. So these are both very important, very rich, educated hobbits. And then we have Sam. Sam is literate because he was taught to read specifically by Bilbo. Bilbo didn't agree with the general thought that a gardener's son who was to become a gardener himself, a tradesman, wouldn't need to read. Bilbo disagreed with that. He rejected the idea that a tradesman would need to know his letters. So we see this thought that the aristocracy, the oligarchy, the rich, the powerful, the important can read and write, and the peasants don't know how to read or write. Sam is an exception because Bilbo rejects that sort of social hierarchy. He thought, well, this kid should learn how to read and write. Everybody should be able to read and write. And Sam's father, Hamfast, most often called the Gaffer, said earlier in the book, I hope no trouble comes from it, which hints towards the idea that Sam, being a lettered man, or a lettered hobbit, as the case may be actually viewed with some suspicion in the Shire. Like, why does he need to read or write? He just tends to the roses and the hedges and that sort of thing. And of course, Sam becomes very important later on. He actually becomes the mayor of Meikle Delving, and for an unprecedented 49 years in a row, 7 terms, and the terms are 7 years long. So Sam actually becomes really important. But at this point, he's nobody. He's just a gardener and a servant. And a good friend of Frodo's, of course. But Frodo sees him as a friend and almost like a brother, while as Sam is like, this is Master Baggins. This is, Mr. Frodo. But anyway, I wanted to mention that now in Bree, they mentioned earlier the whole history of Bree and the history of the inn at Bree and how important it is for trade, for commerce, for the flow of information. And, somebody once asked me on Quora, who is the political leader in Bree? And I said, well, there is no political leader in Bree. Technically, it's part of the kingdom of Elendil. So, once the Return of the King happens, Aragorn is the king, so he is the political leader there, but they don't have a local political leader. During the 1960s, there was supposed to be an animated version of The Lord of the Rings. It never got very far, but they were in talks with Tolkien, and Tolkien would get the script treatments, and he would give them notes and sort of just get increasingly annoyed as it went on, because everything was so wrong to him. And one of the things that was put into this treatment that never got made into a movie that really rankled Tolkien. There were two things that really rankled him. One had to do with the Balrog. But the one that really rankled him that's relevant to our discussion right now is that in this proposed movie, Frodo and all these guys would be asked to sign the guest book at the Prancing Pony. And because that seemed like a normal thing, that you would sign yourself in to an inn and then you would sign yourself out when you leave. And Tolkien said that's ridiculous. There is no government in Bree. There's no taxes in Bree. It's basically like an anarchistic sort of society. Nobody's signing a guest book. It's just a ridiculous thought to Tolkien. So somebody asked me about this, and who was the leader in Bree? And I said, well, technically Aragorn. Before that, really nobody. But a lot of people pointed out that Barlaam Butterbur himself, while not a political leader, is probably the most important man in this town. And I agree with this. I agree with this fully, because they mentioned already the innkeeper is sort of like really important in terms of keeping the inn, because the inn is where everybody meets, where important dealings happen, trade happens there, commerce happens there, everything happens there, so to speak. And here we're finding that he is, not only is he literate, but he's very proud of it, and he's enjoying the display of reading out Gandalf's handwriting to them on the outside of the letter. We're going to continue now. "A letter for me from Gandalf," cried Frodo. "Ah," said Mr. Butterbur, "then your right name is Baggins." "It is," said Frodo, "and you had better give me that letter at once and explain why you never sent it." "That's why you came to tell me, I suppose, though you've taken a long time to come to the point." Poor Mr. Butterbur looked troubled. "You're right, master," he said, "and I beg your pardon, and I'm mortal afraid of what Gandalf will say if harm comes of it. But I didn't keep it back a purpose. I put it by safe. Then I couldn't find nobody willing to go to the Shire the next day nor the day after, and none of my own folk were to spare. And then one thing after another drove it out of my mind. I'm a busy man. I'll do what I can to set matters right, and if there's any trouble I can give, you've only to name it. Leaving the letter aside, I promised Gandalf no less. Barley, he says to me, this friend of mine from the Shire, he may be coming out of this way before long, him and another. He'll be calling himself Underhill, mind that. But you need to ask no questions, and if I'm not with him, he may be in trouble, and he may need help. Do whatever you can for him, and I'll be grateful, he says. And here you are, and trouble is not far off, seemingly. What do you mean? Asked Frodo. These black men, said the landlord, lowering his voice. They're looking for Baggins. And if they mean well, then I'm a hobbit. It was on Monday, and all the dogs were yammering, and all the geese screaming. Uncanny, I called it. Nob, he came and told me 2 black men were at the door asking for a hobbit called Baggins. Nob's hair was all stood on end. I bid the black fellows be off and slammed the door on them. But they've been asking the same question all the way, too. Archet, I hear. And that Ranger Strider, he's been asking questions, too. Tried to get in here to see you before he'd had a bite of sup, he did. He did, said Strider suddenly, coming forward into the light, and much trouble would have been saved if you had let him in, Barlaam. The landlord jumped with surprise. You, he cried. You're always popping up. What do you want now? He's here with my leave, said Frodo. He came to offer me his help. Well, you know your own business, maybe, said Mr. Butterbur, looking suspiciously at Strider. But if I was in your plight, I wouldn't take up with a ranger. Then who would you take up with? Asked Strider. A fat innkeeper who only remembers his own name because people shouted at him all day. They cannot stay in the pony forever, and they cannot go home. They have a long road before them. Will you go with them and keep the black men off? Me? Leave Bree, I wouldn't do that for any money, said Mr. Butterbur, looking really scared. But why can't you stay here quiet for a bit, Mr. Underhill? What are all these queer goings-on? What are all these black men after? And what do they come from? I'd like to know. I'm sorry, I can't explain it all, answered Frodo. I'm tired and very worried, and it's a long tale. But if you mean to help me, I ought to warn you that you will be in danger as long as I am in your house. These black riders, I'm not sure, but I fear they come from... They come from Mordor, said Strider in a low voice. From Mordor, Barlaam, if that means anything to you. Save us, cried Mr. Butterbur, turning pale. The name evidently was known to him. That is the worst news that has come to Bree in my time. It is, said Frodo. Are you willing to help me? I am, said Mr. Butterbur, more than ever, though I don't know what the likes of me can do against... He faltered. Against the shadow in the east, said Strider quietly. Not much, Barlaam, but every little helps. You could let Mr. Underhill stay here tonight as Mr. Underhill, and you can forget the name of Baggins till he is far away. I'll do that, said Butterbur, but they'll find out he's here without help from me, I'm afraid. It's a pity Mr. Baggins drew attention to himself this evening to say no more. The story of that Mr. Bilbo going off has been heard before tonight in Bree. Even our Nob has been doing some guessing in his slow pate, and there are others in Bree quicker at the uptake than he is. Well, we can only hope the riders won't come back yet, said Frodo. I hope not indeed, said Butterbur. But spooks or no spooks, they don't get on the pony so easy. Don't you worry till the morning, Nob will say no word. No black man shall pass my doors while I'm stand on my legs. Me and my folk will keep watch tonight. But you had best get some sleep if you can. I want to pause here. So it's interesting, they keep referring to them as black men, and it's just, because they wear black, you can't really see what they look like, because, I mean, they're invisible. You wouldn't, even if they put their hoods back, you would see nothing. Unless you put on the ring, then you would see what they look like. But because they're wearing all black and they're riding black horses, their mantles are black, the horses are black, and I have something to say about that in just a moment. They're just referred to as black men, and I just think of like Barlaam and Butterbur making this declaration that nobody clad all in black is going to be allowed in to his residence. And then I just imagine some poor traveler just who happens to be wearing a black cloak being turned away, It's like The Simpsons, that guy incognito. If you remember classic Simpsons, there was a thing where Homer was banned from being in Moe's bar, and it kicked him out, and then this guy comes in. It looks exactly like Homer in a really cheesy sort of like fake mustache and outfit, and he sounds like Homer. He's like, "Hello, my name is Guy Incognito," and they're like a Homer, and they beat him up and they throw him out, and then Homer walks by like, "Oh my God, this man is my exact double." And we never saw Guy Incognito. I mean, even the name Guy Incognito, it's like, fake name, You might as well just be called fake name. The other thing I wanted to mention is the whole idea of everything being black. Sauron seems very extra. We learn that the riders, the black riders, the horses are always black. And you might think, well, they must breed terrible black horses in Mordor. Hello there, Sugar Pea. How's it going? And that's actually not the case. The horses that the Nazgul are riding actually come from Rohan. And it's mentioned way, way later that Mordor first tried to just buy the horses from Rohan. They would say, "We want to buy some of your horses." And they were basically told, "Go take a walk. Go take a walk into the Belagir Sea. Get out of our faces. So we're not selling you any horses. We don't have anything to do with Mordor." So they did what anybody would do in this situation, and they just stole the horses. But it's mentioned specifically by Éomer that Mordor not only steals horses from Rohan, because this is where the very best horses are, but they only steal black horses. But I'm just thinking, a lot of people have made jokes about this, that Sauron is just color coordinating everything. Everybody gets a black robe, everybody gets black daggers, everybody gets a black horse with a black saddle, and it's just sort of interesting. It seems funny, but it actually really makes sense to Sauron's personality. Way before he was called Sauron, his true name is Mairon, and he was an angel of Aula. Aula was, I mentioned Aula earlier. Aula is the angel that's sort of the craftsman. he made the dwarves, and he created many great crafts, and he had a lot of pupils, and a lot of his pupils turned out not so great. Sauron was one of them. Saruman is one of his pupils. Feanor was one of his pupils. All bad, right? Not all of his pupils turned out bad, but he seemed to attract a certain type. I actually wrote an article about this on Quora just today about Aula attracting a certain type of person. It doesn't reflect poorly on Aula. It just happened to be that way. But anyway, Myron's whole thing is order. He's made to love order and hate chaos, and this seems like a good thing. But if there was a therapist of some sort in Middle-earth, Sauron, would have been diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, OCPD. Now, what's interesting about this, there's OCD, which is obsessive-compulsive disorder, and there's OCPD, which is obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. Now, the symptoms are very similar, and they manifest in many different ways. But the difference between OCD and OCPD is that when you have OCD, you know something's up. You know that this is not right. Like, you may feel the need to close a door 3 times in a row. And you know that you shouldn't do that's probably irritating people around you, and it's not necessary, but you have this compulsion to, you feel like everything is going to go wrong if you don't take certain actions. When you have OCPD, you don't know that it's wrong, and you wonder why everybody else is not doing it. Why isn't everybody else closing the door 8 times in a row? Why isn't everybody else scrubbing the floor until, midnight? Why isn't everybody else turning around 3 times every time they walk into a room, or whatever else? There's a lot of different tics that come through with obsessive compulsive. But when you have a special interest and obsessive compulsive personality disorder, with the special interest in Myron's case being the love of order and the hatred of chaos, it can manifest in some pretty dark ways. And what we see is that Myron has come to the conclusion that freedom is chaos, and that he has to save Middle-earth from all of the chaos by bringing it to order. He's not like his master Morgoth. Morgoth, Melkor, Satan, whatever you want to call him, he just wanted to destroy everything that was good. He was evil for evil's sake. And he knows he's evil. He invented the concept of evil. But Sauron's different. Sauron thinks he's the hero of the story. He thinks, look at all these people in their crazy, chaotic lives. They're suffering. I can help them. And when we have a fallen angel who's obsessed with order and wants to bring everything to heel under him so that he can impose order on everybody and micromanage every aspect of everyone's life, of course all of the 9 riders' horses are going to be the same color. Of course they're all going to wear one color. So that's where that comes from. But I always just think it's amusing for Barlaman to say, no black man will come through. And then I just imagine somebody else with a black cloak just looking for a beer and getting yelled at. Maybe he would have an elvish name like Guy Incognito, I'll have to come up with an elvish name that means the same thing as Guy Incognito. Well, let's continue here. Where was I, though? Here we are. In any case, we must be called at dawn, said Frodo. We must get off as early as possible. Breakfast at 6:30, please. Right. I'll see to the others, said the landlord. See to the order, said the landlord. Good night, Mr. Baggins. Underhill, I should say. Good night now. Bless me. Where's your Mr. Brandybuck? I don't know, said Frodo with sudden anxiety. They had forgotten all about Merry, and it was getting late. I'm afraid he is out. He said something about going for a breath of air. Well, you do want to be looking after. No mistake, your party might be on holiday, said Butterbur. I must go and bar the doors quickly, but I'll see your friend is let in when he comes. I'd better send Nob out to look for him. Good night to you all. At last Mr. Butterbur went out, with another doubtful look at Strider and a shake of his head. His footsteps retreated down the passage. Well, said Strider, when are you going to open that letter? Frodo looked carefully at the seal before he broke it. It seemed certainly to be Gandalf's. Oh, I have to pause here because this is something that bothers me. They always get letters and then they break the seals. And I don't ever break seals. Like, here is, let me just switch to the larger camera here. Hold on. Here is a letter I got from Matt. You might know him as Lore Master on Quora. And he does you can't see it very well. It's a, Matt Richardson, also from the Council of Tolkien. There is a seal on this, and I always make sure that I open it without breaking the seal. Can you see it? It's not, the camera's not really picking up with it. It's Morgoth's crown, and I always try to open it without breaking this. It's very easy to open a letter without breaking the wax seal if it has a wax seal. And he always writes my name in runes too, which is very amusing too. So there you have it. I'm going to have to send him something back at some point just to maybe I'll write a letter in Tangwar just to mess with him. Okay. I'll write it in English, but I'll use Tangwar. I'm not going to make him translate it, first from Tangwar into normal letters and then from Elvish. That would be pretty funny. Okay, let's see. It seems certainly to be Gandalf's. Inside, written in the wizard's strong but graceful script, was the following message. The Prancing Pony, Bree, Mid-Year's Day, Shire Year 1418. Dear Frodo, bad news has reached me here. I must go off at once. You had better leave Bag End soon, and get out of the Shire before the end of July at latest. I will return as soon as I can, and I will follow you if I find that you are gone. Leave a message for me here if you pass through Bree. You can trust the landlord, Butterbur. You may meet a friend of mine on the road, a man, lean, dark, tall, by some called Strider. He knows our business and will help you. Make for Rivendell. Then I hope we may meet again. If I do not come, Elrond will advise you. Yours in haste, Gandalf. P.S. Do not use it again, for any reason whatever. Do not travel by night. P.P.S. Make sure that it is the real Strider. There are many strange men on the road. His true name is Aragorn. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all who wander are lost. The old thing that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes of fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king. P.P.P.S. I hope Butterbur sends this promptly. A worthy man, but his memory is like a lumber room. Thing wanted always buried. If he forgets, I shall roast him. Farewell. Frodo read the letter to himself and then passed it to Pippin and Sam. Really, old Butterbur has made a mess of things, he said. He deserves roasting. If I had got this at once, we might have been safe in Rivendell by now. But what can have happened to Gandalf? He writes as if he was going into great danger. He's been doing that for many years, said Strider. Frodo turned and looked at him thoughtfully, wondering about Gandalf's second postscript. Why didn't you tell me that you were Gandalf's friend at once, he asked. It would have saved time. Would it? Would any of you have believed me till now, said Strider. I knew nothing of this letter. For all I knew, I had to persuade you to trust me without proofs, if I was to help you. In any case, I did not intend to tell you all about myself at once. I had to study you first, to make sure of you. The enemy has set traps for me before now. As soon as I have made up my mind, I was ready to tell you whatever you asked. But I must admit, he added with a queer laugh, that I hoped you would take to me for my own sake. A hunted man sometimes wearies of distrust and longs for friendship. But there I believe my looks are against me. They are, at first sight at any rate, laughed Pippin with sudden relief after reading Gandalf's letter. But handsome is as handsome does, as you say in the Shire. And I dare say we shall all look much the same after lying for days in hedges and ditches. It would take more than a few days or weeks or years of wandering in the wild to make you look like Strider, he answered. And you would die first, unless you are made of sterner stuff than you look to be. Pippin subsided, but Sam was not daunted, and he still eyed Strider dubiously. How do we know you're the Strider that Gandalf speaks about, he demanded. You never mentioned Gandalf till this letter came out. You might be a play-acting spy for all I could see, trying to get us to go with you. You might have done in the real Strider and took his clothes. What have you to say to that? I shall roast him. Yeah, the humor in this is underappreciated, I think. When people think of humor from The Lord of the Rings, they often think of the movies, and the movies have many, many fine humorous moments. Some of them are from the book. Potatoes, that's from the book. One moment that I wish that they had put in the films, because it is so funny to me, is when they're leaving Bag End, and Frodo calls for Sam, and Sam is in the back. It takes him a moment, and Tolkien writes it out as he had been saying goodbye to the beer casks. And I was just speaking with Matt and Sid not too long ago, and I said I just imagined Sam with his head under the tap, just pouring the beer down directly into his mouth, and then Sid added, and then the last few drops, it's the very last bit of it. That would be very funny. There's a lot of humor in The Lord of the Rings, and it's underappreciated, I think. I shall roast him was a great line there. Okay, where were we here? Okay. That you are a stout fellow, answered Strider, but I am afraid my only answer to you, Sam Gamgee, is this. If I had killed the real Strider, I could kill you. And I should have killed you already without so much talk. If I was after the ring, I could have it now. He stood up and seemed suddenly to grow taller. In his eyes gleamed a light, keen and commanding. Throwing back his cloak, he laid his hand on the hilt of a sword that had hung concealed by his side. They did not dare to move. Sam sat wide-mouthed, staring at him dumbly. But I am the real Strider, fortunately, he said, looking down at them with his face softened by a sudden smile. I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and if by life or death I can save you, I will. I just remembered another moment from The Return of the King that's very funny, because he's messing with them here. He's like, I could kill you now, and he acts like he's going to pull out his sword. He doesn't pull out his sword. His sword's broken anyway. It would have done him very much good. He's just messing with them. He smiles. Aragorn has a bit of a sense of humor, and there's this part where Merry is resting in the hospital at Minas Tirith, the Houses of Healing, and he can't find his tobacco pouch to smoke, and he asks Aragorn if he can borrow some pipe weed from him. And Aragorn basically tells him to go screw himself. He's like, nope, you're out of luck, and then he leaves. And Pippin says, as soon as Aragorn looks at them, he says, "What's wrong with you? Your bag's right next to you. He was messing with you." There was a long silence. At last, Frodo spoke with hesitation. I believe that you were a friend before the letter came, he said. Or at least I wished to. You have frightened me several times tonight, but never in the way that servants of the enemy would, or so I imagine. I think one of his spies would, seem fairer and feel fouler, if you understand. I see, laughed Strider. I look foul and feel fair, is that it? All that is gold does not glitter, and all those that wander are lost. Not all those that wander are lost. Did the verses apply to you, then? Asked Frodo. I could not make out what they were about. But how did you know they were in Gandalf's letter if you've never seen it? I did not know, he answered, but I am Aragorn, and those verses go with that name. He drew out his sword, and they saw that the blade was indeed broken a foot below the hilt. Not much use, is it, Sam? Said Strider. But the time is near when it shall be forged anew. Sam said nothing. Well, said Strider, with Sam's permission, we shall call that settled. Strider shall be your guide. We shall have a rough road tomorrow. Even if we are allowed to leave Bree unhindered, we can hardly hope now to leave it unnoticed. But I shall try to get lost as soon as possible. I know one or two ways out of Bree land other than the main road. If once we shake off their pursuit, I shall make for Weathertop. Weathertop, said Sam. What is that? It is a hill just to the north of the road, about halfway from here to Rivendell. It commands a wide view all round, and there we shall have a chance to look about us. Gandalf will make for that point if he follows us. After Weathertop, our journey will become more difficult, and we shall have to choose between various dangers." "When did you last see Gandalf?" asked Frodo. "Do you know where he is, or what he is doing?" Strider looked grave. "I do not know," he said. "I came west with him in the spring. I have often kept watch on the borders of the Shire in the last few years, when he was busy elsewhere. He seldom left it unguarded. We last met on the 1st of May at Sarn Ford down by the Brandywine. He told me that his business with you had gone well, and that you would be starting for Rivendell in the last week of September. As I knew he was by your side, I went away on a journey of my own. And that has proven ill, and for plainly some news reached him, and I was not at hand to help. I am troubled for the first time since I have known him. We should have had messages, even if he could not come back himself. When I returned many days ago, I heard the ill news. The tidings had gone far and wide that Gandalf was missing, and that horsemen were seen. It was the elven folk of Gildor that told me this, and later they told me that you left their home. And there was no news of your leaving of Buckland. I have been watching the East Road anxiously." "Do you think the Black Riders have anything to do with it? With Gandalf's absence, I mean," asked Frodo. "I do not know of anything else that could have hindered him, except the enemy himself," said Strider. "But do not give up hope. Gandalf is greater than you Shire folk know. As a rule, you can only see his jokes and toys. But this business of ours will be his greatest task." Pippin yawned. "I am sorry," he said, "but I am dead tired. In spite of all the danger and worry, I must go to bed or sleep where I sit. Where is that silly fellow Merry? It would be the last straw if we had to go out in the dark to look for him." At that moment they heard a door slam, then feet come running along the passage. Merry came in with a rush, followed by Nob. He shut the door hastily and leaned against it. He was out of breath. They stared at him in alarm for a moment before he gasped, "I have seen them, Frodo. I have seen them. Black Riders. Black Riders," cried Frodo. "Where?" "Here, in the village. I stayed indoors for an hour. Then, as you did not come back out, I went out for a stroll. I had come back again and was standing just outside the light of the lamp looking at the stars. Suddenly I shivered and felt something horrible was creeping." Sorry, a little bit of indigestion here. Let me take some water. I'll start that part over. "Here, in the village. I stayed indoors for an hour. Then, as you did not come back, I went out for a stroll. I'd come back again, and was standing just outside the light of the lamp looking at the stars. Suddenly I shivered and felt something horrible was creeping near. There was a sort of deeper shade among the shadows across the road, and just beyond the edge of the lamplight. It slid away at once into the dark without a sound. There was no horse." "Which way did it go?" asked Strider suddenly and sharply. Merry started, noticing the stranger for the first time. "Go on," said Frodo. "This is a friend of Gandalf's. I will explain later." "It seemed to make off the road, eastward," continued Merry. "I tried to follow. Of course it vanished almost at once, but I went round the corner and on as far as the last house on the road." Strider looked at Merry with wonder. "You have a stout heart," he said. "But it was foolish." "I don't know," said Merry. "Neither brave nor silly, I think, and I could hardly help myself. I seemed to be drawn somehow. Anyway, I went, and suddenly I heard voices by the hedge. One was muttering, and the other was whispering or hissing. I couldn't hear a word that was said. I did not creep any closer because I began to tremble all over. Then I felt terrified, and I turned back, and I was just going to bolt home, when something came behind me, and I fell over." "I found him, sir," put in Nob. "Mr. Butterbur sent me out with a lantern. I went down to the west gate, and then back up towards South Gate. Just nigh Bill Ferny's house, I thought I could see something in the road. I couldn't swear to it, but it looked to me as if two men were stooping over something, lifting it. I gave a shout, but when I got up to the spot there were no signs of them, and only Mr. Brandybuck laying by the roadside. He seemed to be asleep. I thought I had fallen into deep water, he says to me when I shook him. Very queer he was, and as soon as I had roused him he got off and ran back up here like a hare." "I'm afraid that's true," said Merry. "And though I don't know what I said, I had an ugly dream, which I can't remember. I went to pieces. I don't know what came over me." "I do," said Strider. "The Black Breath. The riders must have left their horses outside and passed through the south gate in secret. They will know all the news now, for they have visited Bill Ferny, and probably that southerner was a spy as well. Something may happen in the night before we leave Bree." "What will happen?" said Merry. "Will they attack the inn?" "No, I think not," said Strider. "They are not all here yet, and in any case that is not their way. In dark and loneliness they are strongest. They will not openly attack a house when there are lights and many people, not until they are desperate, not while all the long leagues of Eriador still lie before us. But their power is in terror, and already some in Bree are in their clutch. They will drive these wretches to some evil work, Fernie and some of the strangers, and maybe the gatekeeper too. They had words with Harry at Westgate on Monday. I was watching them. He was white and shaking when they left him." "We seem to have enemies all round," said Frodo. "What are we to do?" "Stay here, and do not go to your rooms. They are sure to have found out which those are. The Hobbit rooms have windows looking north and close to the ground. We will all remain together, and bar this window and the door. But first Nob and I will fetch your luggage." While Strider was gone, Frodo gave Merry a rapid account of all that had happened since supper. Merry was still reading and pondering Gandalf's letter when Strider and Nob returned. "Well, master," said Nob, "I've ruffled up the clothes and put a bolster down in the middle of each bed. And I made a nice imitation of your head with a brown woolen mat, Mr. Underhill, sir," he added with a grin. Pippin laughed. "Very lifelike," he said. "But what will happen when they have penetrated the disguise?" "We shall see," said Strider. "Let us hope to hold the fort till morning." "Good night to you," said Nob, and went off to take his part in the watch on the doors. Their bags and gear they piled on the parlor floor. They pushed a low chair against the door and shut the window. Peering out, Frodo saw that the night was still clear. The sickle was swinging bright above the shoulders of Bree Hill. He then closed and barred the heavy inside shutters and drew the curtains together. Strider built up the fire and blew out all the candles. The hobbits lay down on their blankets with their feet toward the hearth, but Strider settled himself in the chair against the door. They talked for a little, and Merry still had several questions to ask. "Jumped over the moon," chuckled Merry as he rolled himself in his blanket. "Very ridiculous of you, Frodo, but I wish I had been there to see. The worthies of Bree will be discussing it 100 years hence." "I hope so," said Strider. Then they all fell silent, and one by one the hobbits dropped off to sleep. Okay, so that's the end of the chapter, and we're gonna stop to discuss a few things here. So first, let me mention there is a bit of a footnote here. When it was mentioned the sickle. The sickle was swinging bright above the shoulders of Bree Hill. And there's a note here saying that the sickle is the hobbit's name for the plow or great bear, and which might not seem to really offer much information. Okay, what is that? What is the plow? What is the great bear? What are they talking about? It's a constellation, and it's actually also known in universe as the Valakirka, which is 7 stars in a very specific pattern. Valakirka obviously referring specifically to the Valar, and every culture in Middle-earth has a different name for the Valakirka, and it means something different to all of them. The dwarves call it Durin's crown. The wild men would call it the bear. Some call it the plow. In real life, we call it the Big Dipper. So there you have it. That's what has to do with that. Now, interesting question cropped up on Quora not long ago, which was relating to an earlier conversation between Frodo and Gandalf, where in the few months that Gandalf is staying with Frodo, he mentions that he had heard some ill news and that he must be off. And the question from Quora was essentially a 3-part question. Who was he talking to? Where was this meeting? And what had he heard that was giving him anxiety? And it's one of those things that you're never told directly, but you piece it together through different bits of information. And here we can see it was at Sarnford. The person was Aragorn. And Aragorn makes mention of the Black Breath. A lot of people think that what happened to Merry is that he went out and somebody snuck up behind him and must have clobbered him, laid him out. They were about to go dragging him off, perhaps thinking that he was the ring bearer. And then Nob came off shouting, and the 2 men that were there ran off. And that's probably what actually happened, because they weren't Nazgul. Or at least if they were, it seems to me unlikely that Nob would scare them off. I don't know, maybe he would. He did have a lantern, so I guess they could have been Nazgul. But anyway, the Black Breath is this sort of thing where the Nazgul can just breathe on you and just cause you to just fall ill and lose consciousness, perhaps even become poisoned. So, and the news that was giving Gandalf anxiety was that the Black Breath was being used in the war in the South. So it's interesting that Tolkien has all these things that happen that you have to sort of piece together from different aspects of it. There we have it. We're gonna be able to do one more chapter. We're only doing 3 chapters today, but the Fellowship of the Ring is a much slower read to get through than The Hobbit. Partly because it's a denser text, and partly because there's just so much more to talk about. Like when we started with chapter 10, was it 10? No, not even. No, chapter 8, rather, because that was chapter 9. We're about to read... No, I'm sorry, that was chapter 10. We're about to read chapter 11. I had so much to say just from the first few paragraphs, and it's just so much information is in here. Nobody is going to understand this first read-through. I mean, unless I guess this is your first read-through and you're listening to me read it and explain everything. But even then, there's little things that I'll be reading and I'll be like, oh, I got to talk about that, and then it flies out of my head and I never talk about it. But anyway, here's chapter 11, A Knife in the Dark. As they prepared for sleep at the inn in Bree, darkness lay on Buckland. A mist strayed in the dells and along the riverbank. The house at Crick Hollow stood silent. Fatty Bulger opened the door cautiously and peered out. A feeling of fear had been growing on him all day, and he was unable to rest or go to bed. There was a brooding threat in the breathless night air. As he stared out into the gloom, a black shadow moved under the trees. The gate seemed to open of its own accord and close again without a sound. Terror seized him. He shrank back, and for a moment he stood trembling in the hall. Then he shut and locked the door. The night deepened. There came the soft sound of horses, led with stealth along the lane. Outside the gate they stopped, and 3 black figures entered, like shades of night creeping across the ground. One went to the door, one to the corner of the house on either side, and there they stood as still as the shadows of stones, while night went slowly on. The house and the quiet trees seemed to be waiting breathlessly. There was a faint stir in the leaves, and a cock crowed far away. The cold hour before dawn was passing. The figure by the door moved. In the dark, without moon or stars, a drawn blade gleamed, as if a chill light had been unsheathed. There was a blow, soft but heavy, and the door shuddered. "Open in the name of Mordor," said a voice thin and menacing. At a second blow, the door yielded and fell back, with timbers burst, and lock broken. The black figures passed swiftly in. At that moment, among the trees nearby, a horn rang out. It rent the night, like fire on a hilltop. "Awake! Fear! Fire! Foes! Awake!" Fatty Bulger had not been idle. As soon as he saw the dark shapes creep up from the gardens, he knew that he must run for it or perish. And run he did, out the back door, through the garden, and over the fields. When he reached the nearest house, more than a mile away, he collapsed on the doorstep. "No, no, no," he was crying. "Not me. I haven't got it." It was some time before anyone could make out what he was babbling about. At last they got the idea that enemies were in Buckland. Some strange invasion from the old forest, and then they lost no more time. Fear, fire, foes! The brandy-bucks were blowing the horn call of Buckland that had not been sounded for 100 years, not since the white wolves came in the fell winter when the brandy wine was frozen over. "Awake! Awake!" Far away answering horns were heard. The alarm was spreading. The black figures spread from the house. One of them let fall a hobbit cloak on the step as he ran. In the lane the noise of hoofs broke out, and gathering to a gallop went hammering away into the darkness. All about Crick Hollow there came the sound of horns blowing, and voices crying, and feet running. But the black riders rode like a gale to the north gate. Let the little people blow. Sauron would deal with them later. Meanwhile they had another errand. They knew now that the house was empty, and that the ring had gone. They rode down the guards at the gate and vanished from the Shire. Okay, let's pause here. So we briefly go back to the Shire, to Buckland, and find out, well, what became of Fatty Bulger. Fatty has been staying in Frodo's house, dressing as him, wearing his clothes, sort of giving off the impression that somebody's still living in the house, and it might even be Frodo. Now, what's interesting there, we know there are 9 Nazgul, and there are 3 here, which means that, there are others out there, and we know that there are some in Bree, right? So there are 6 of them that are not here in this exact location. And it's always interesting, if they had just one more, they would have had poor Fatty. He would have died right there. It wouldn't have helped them much because he doesn't have the ring. But in that fear, he was able to run out the back door because one was guarding the front, 2 on either side of the house, and he was able to get out the back and sort of raise the alarm. And then they're like, hey, this isn't worth it. When we learned what we came here to learn, whoever the ring bearer is not here. And you might be like, oh man, Fatty, you shouldn't have said anything, because he's yelling, it's not me, I don't have it. That's the fear, the aura of fear that they project. They force Frodo to want to put on the ring. They make Merry feel anxiety, and everyone around the Nazgul is feeling a great deal of fear. And if they take their cloaks off, that aura is actually more powerful. The cloaks actually somewhat dampen the fear aura. And this is by design. It's so they could speak with people and sort of, terrorize them a little bit, like we see with Harry and Bree and Bill Ferny and whatnot. But leave them with their wits. We don't want them to just be on the floor drooling. That would be bad for them. They wouldn't get anybody to do what they need to do, because they can't do a whole lot for themselves in a lot, when there's light and fire involved and stuff like that. The other thing that I want to mention is this line that came out, opened in the name of Mordor. This is the first time that we hear one of the Nazgul actually speak. And this guy that said this, he actually has a name. He's called Kamel the Easterling. Now, we don't know the names of most of the Nazgul. We know the Witch King of Angmar. He's the leader. And we know Kamel. This is Kamel. So, yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Let's move onwards here. In the early night, Frodo woke from deep sleep suddenly, as if some sound or presence had disturbed him. He saw that Strider was sitting alert in his chair. His eyes gleamed in the light of the fire, which had been tended and was burning brightly, but he made no sign or movement. Frodo soon went to sleep again, but his dreams were again troubled with the noise of wind and of galloping hoofs. The wind seemed to be curling round the house and shaking it, and far off he heard a horn blowing wildly. He opened his eyes and heard a cock crowing lustily in the inn-yard. Strider had drawn the curtains and pushed back the shutters with a clang. The first grey light of day was in the room, and a cold air was coming through the open window. So, just to pause to say, they're in Bree, and Frodo is able to kind of hear these horns that are going in Buckland. They must be pretty loud. Just saying. I mean, obviously, Buckland is a little closer to Bree than it seemed, because they went south through the old forest, and they got distracted, and they got lost, and they got captured at one point. If they'd just gone off on the road, it would, Bree is just right there. But it's still a few miles, so those horns must be pretty loud. As soon as Strider had roused them all, he led the way to their bedrooms. When they saw them, they were glad that they had taken his advice. The windows had been forced open and were swinging, and the curtains were flapping. The beds were tossed about, and the bolsters slashed and flung upon the floor. The brown mat was torn to pieces. Strider immediately went to fetch the landlord. Poor Mr. Butterbur looked sleepy and frightened. He had hardly closed his eyes all night, or so he said. But he had never heard a sound. Never has such a thing happened in my time, he cried, raising his hands in horror. Guests unable to sleep in their beds, and good bolsters ruined and all. What are we coming to? Dark times, said Strider. But for the present, you may be left in peace when you have got rid of us. We will leave at once. Never mind about breakfast. A drink and a bite standing will have to do. We shall be packed in a few minutes. Mr. Butterbur hurried off to see that their ponies were got ready and to fetch them a bite. But very soon he came back in dismay. The ponies had vanished. The stable doors had all been opened in the night, and they were gone. Not only Merry's ponies, but every other horse and beast in the place. Frodo was crushed by the news. How could they hope to reach Rivendell on foot, pursued by mounted enemies? I might as well set out for the moon. Strider sat silent for a while, looking at the hobbits as if he were weighing up their strength and courage. I just have to pause there to just comment on Frodo's notion of going to the moon. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the poem that Bilbo wrote and the nature of the man in the moon, of being an angel named Tilion, who has this giant bow and all that. And it actually, there's a lot more about Tilion and Arien that I could talk about, but now he's mentioning like, oh man, walking to Rivendell, that seems ridiculous. I might as well go to the moon. And of course he's going to walk all the way to Mordor, but that's neither here nor there. He doesn't know that he's going to do that yet. But what's interesting is very late in Tolkien's life, he had this idea that this sort of fantastical mythology that I had described earlier about the sun and the moon and a lot of these different things were not really true, but were just elvish mythology. Just as like the Book of Lost Tales, which is in two parts. There's the Book of Lost Tales Part 1 and Part 2. Part 2 greatly concerning the fall of Gondolin. But if you were to read the elvish account of the fall of Gondolin, which you can find in the Silmarillion, you would find it very different from the account found in the Book of Lost Tales. Now, out of universe, meaning here in the real world, the reason for this is because the Book of Lost Tales was a much earlier draft. So there were ideas that were not present in later drafts, such as Balrogs being quite numerous, and they were not fallen angels, they were just these fire demons. There was a line in the Book of Lost Tales Part 2 that said that Tur killed 5 Balrogs. And then, of course, later on, Tolkien stated that there were never any more than 7 Balrogs total. So obviously that line about Tur killing 5 of them doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I digress. In universe, we understand that the Book of Lost Tales, whether it's Part 1 or Part 2, whether it's the Fall of Gondolin or any of the other stories found in the Book of Lost Tales, are in universe accounts of things that did happen, but not necessarily in the way that they did happen. A corrupted tale, an oral retelling, that they're the stories of men. The Hobbit is a story of hobbits, obviously. But in the story, The Quest for Erebor, Gandalf explains that what Bilbo wrote is not really the way it happened. This is just the way that Bilbo told the story. And he had his reasons for changing things, for omitting things, for even adding things. So Tolkien had this idea that the Silmarillion itself was just an elvish tale. Now we come to understand that the elves are right about everything and that everybody else is wrong. The men are wrong about the fall of Gondolin. Tur didn't really kill 5 Balrogs. There weren't ever 5 Balrogs that could be killed. There were only 7 of them, and they were too powerful for a man to fight, much less kill. But you could see how the telling through men who have these much shorter lifespans, so the corruption of the tale happens at a rapid pace. They're not immortal, where you can hear the story from one guy and then 3,000 years later hear the same story again from the same guy, and it won't change. But 3,000 years is a lot of generations of men, so the story winds up changing because it's passing from person to person. They all add their bits of flair. They all tell it differently. Things get lost. Things get added, and such and such and such. Tolkien had the idea that the 2 trees never really existed. The sun is not really a fruit. The moon is not really a flower. All of that is not real. The world was always round. It wasn't flat initially and then changed to being round in the Second Age. That's just an elvish tale. So he had this idea. It never was implemented. It was just an outline. You could read about this in the book Morgoth's Ring. And there's a section called Myths Transformed, which is all of Tolkien's ideas that never got past the outline phase. And what's interesting is that Morgoth's fortress would have been on the moon. So the idea of going to the moon in this context would be, which seems ridiculous to Frodo and would have seemed ridiculous to an elf who would just say that light that you see, the moon, that's just Tilion bearing the vessel of the the son of Telperion the Silver through the sky. That's not like a place that you could go to. It's not very big, But Tolkien had this idea that they were wrong. That was just their mythology, and that the moon was just literally the moon. And that's where Morgoth's fortress was, which doesn't make sense, and it's probably why he never implemented, because how could the elves believe that the moon was just a flower when they went there to fight him? And then we would start asking the questions. How did they get there? Did Yarandil gather everybody into a ship to fly them up there and make like a lot of trips to get the host of the Valar up there? Did the Valar make some sort of bridge to the moon? Like I said, this sort of idea never got very far, but it's sort of interesting just because Frodo mentions walking to the moon. Okay, let's continue where we were. And I've talked so much that now I have to find where I was. Okay. Ponies will not help to... let's try that again. Ponies would not help us to escape horsemen, he said at last thoughtfully, as if he guessed what Frodo had in mind. We should not go much slower on foot, not on the roads I mean to take. I was going to walk in any case. It is the food and stores that trouble me. We cannot count on getting anything to eat between here and Rivendell, except what we can take with us. And we ought to take plenty to spare, for we may be delayed, or forced to go roundabout far out of the direct way. How much are you prepared to carry on your backs? As much as we must, said Pippin with a sinking heart, but trying to show that he was tougher than he looked or felt. I can carry enough for two, said Sam defiantly. Can't anything be done, Mr. Butterbur? Asked Frodo. Can't we get a couple of ponies in the village, or even just one for the baggage? I don't suppose we could hire them, but we might be able to buy them, he added, doubtful, wondering if he could afford it. I doubt it, said the landlord unhappily. The 2 or 3 riding ponies that were here in Bree were stabled in my yard, and they're gone. As for other animals, horses or ponies for draft or what not, there are very few of them in here in Bree, and they won't be for sale. But I'll do what I can. I'll root out Bob and send him round as soon as I may be. Yes, said Strider reluctantly. You'd better do that. I'm afraid we shall have to try to get 1 pony at least. But so ends all hope of starting early and slipping away quietly. We might as well have to blow a horn to announce our departure. That was part of their plan, no doubt. There is 1 crumb of comfort, said Merry. And more than a crumb, I hope. We can have breakfast while we wait and sit down to it. Let's get hold of Nob. In the end, there was more than 3 hours' delay. Bob came back with the report that no horse or pony was to be got for love or money in the neighborhood, except one. Bill Fernie had one that he might possibly sell. A poor old half-starved creature it is, said Bob, but he won't part with it for less than thrice its worth, seeing as how we're placed. Not if I knows Bill Fernie. Bill Fernie, said Frodo. Isn't there some trick? Wouldn't the beast bolt back to him with all our stuff? Or help in tracking us or something? I wonder, said Strider, but I cannot imagine any animal running home to him once it's got away. I fancy this is only an afterthought of kind Master Fernie's, just a way of increasing his profits from the affair. The chief danger is that the poor beast is probably at death's door, but there does not seem to be any choice. What does he want for it? Bill Fernie's price was 12 silver pennies, and that was indeed at least 3 times the pony's value in those parts. It proved to be a bony, underfed, and dispirited animal, but it did not look like dying just yet. Mr. Butterbur paid for it himself and offered Mary another 18 pence as some compensation for the lost animals. He was an honest man and well off as things were reckoned in Bree, but 30 silver pennies was a sore blow to him, and being cheated by Bill Fernie made it harder to bear. So, Tolkien doesn't come directly out and say exactly what happened here, but you could infer it from the usage of names and such. Frodo mentioned earlier that he felt that he didn't have a lot of money. He didn't take a lot of money with him, and even though he is quite wealthy, he didn't bring money with him, so, how is he going to spend anything? And of course, through the course of the adventure, he doesn't need money except for this one part. And 12 silver pennies is quite a lot of cash for this part of the world at this time, and he doesn't have it. And it was actually Merry that paid for the ponies, and that's why Butterbur was basically getting him his change and compensating him and everything. So like I said, in the early bits of it, Merry is sort of the leader. We're going into this transition where it's going to become Aragorn as the leader now. As a matter of fact, he came out on the right side in the end. It turned out later that only one horse had actually been stolen. The others had been driven off or had bolted in terror and were found wandering in different corners of the Bree land. Merry's ponies had escaped altogether, and eventually, having a good deal of sense, they made their way to the downs in search of Fatty Lumpkin. So they came under the care of Tom Bombadil for a while and were well off. But when news of the events at Bree came to Tom's ears, he sent them to Mr. Butterbur, who thus got 5 good beasts at a very fair price. They had to work harder in Bree, but Bob treated them well. So on the whole they were lucky, and they missed a dark and dangerous journey, but they never came to Rivendell. However, in the meanwhile, for all Mr. Butterbur knew, his money was gone for good or for bad. And he had other troubles, for there was a great commotion as soon as the remaining guests were astir, and heard news of the raid on the inn. The southern travelers had lost several horses and blamed the innkeeper loudly, until it became known that one of their own member had also disappeared in the night, none other than Bill Ferny's squint-eyed companion. Suspicion fell on him at once. "If you pick up with a horse thief, and bring him into my house," said Butterbur angrily, "you ought to pay for all the damage yourself and not come shouting at me. Go and ask Ferny where your handsome friend is." But it appeared that he was nobody's friend, and nobody could recollect when he had joined their party. After their breakfast, the hobbits had to repack and get together further supplies for the longer journey they were now expecting. It was close on 10 o'clock before they at last got off. By that time, the whole of Bree was buzzing with excitement. Frodo's vanishing trick, the appearance of the Black Horseman, the robbing of the stables, and not least the news that Strider the Ranger had joined the mysterious hobbits, made such a tale as would last for many uneventful years. Most of the inhabitants of Bree and Staddle, and many even from Combe and Atchet, were crowded in on the road to see the travelers start. The other guests in the inn were at the doors or hanging out of the windows. Strider had changed his mind, and he decided to leave Bree by the main road. Any attempt to set off cross-country would only make matters worse. Half the inhabitants would follow them to see what they were up to, and to prevent them from trespassing. They said farewell to Nob and Bob, and took leave of Mr. Butterbur with many thanks. "I hope we shall meet again some day when things are merry once more," said Frodo. "I should like nothing more than to stay in your house in peace for a while." They tramped off, anxious and downhearted under the eyes of the crowd. Not all the faces were friendly, nor all the words that were shouted, but Strider seemed to be held in awe by most of the Breelanders, and those that he stared at shut their mouths and drew away. He walked in front with Frodo. Next came Merry and Pippin, and last came Sam leading the pony, which was laden with as much of their baggage as they had the heart to give to it. But already it looked less dejected, as if it approved of the changes in its fortunes. Sam was chewing an apple thoughtfully. He had a pocket full of them, a parting present from Nob and Bob. "Apples for walking and a pipe for sitting," he said, "but I doubt I'll miss them both before long." The hobbits took no notice of the inquisitive heads that peeped out of doors or popped over walls and fences as they passed. But as they drew near the further gate, Frodo saw a dark, ill-kept house behind a thick hedge, the last house in the village. In one of the windows he caught a glimpse of a sallow face with sly, slanting eyes, but it vanished at once. "So that's where that southerner is hiding," he thought. "He looks more than half like a goblin." Over the hedge another man was staring boldly. He had heavy black brows and dark, scornful eyes. His large mouth curled in a sneer. He was smoking a short black pipe. As they approached, he took it out of his mouth and spat. "Morning, Longshanks," he said. "Off early. Found some friends at last." Strider nodded, but did not answer. "Morning, my little friends," he said to the others. "I suppose you know what you've taken up with. That's Stick-it-not Strider, that is, though I've heard other names not so pretty. Watch out tonight. And you, Sammy, don't go ill-treating my poor pony. Pah!" He spat again. Sam turned quickly. "And you, Ferny," he said, "put your ugly face out of sight or we'll get hurt." With a sudden flick, quick as lightning, an apple left his hand and hit Bill square on the nose. He ducked too late, and curses came from behind the hedge. "Waste of a good apple," said Sam regretfully, and strode on. There's another bit of humor for you, right? Sam, not only does he clobber Bill Ferny with an apple, hits him right on the nose, and then he says, that was a waste of an apple. There's another sort of like little line like that with Wormtongue when he's running out of Edoras. And Theoden says, don't stop him, let him go. You give him a horse if he wants one. And Éomer says, if one will bear him. Which is a pretty scathing remark to say in Rohan, which is horse country. They're the horse masters. So to say that one of the Rohirrim a horse would not suffer to be ridden by him, that's a pretty scathing remark, actually. At last they left the village behind. The escort of children and stragglers that had followed them got tired and turned back at the south gate. Passing through, they kept on along the road for some miles. It bent to the left, curving back into its eastward line as it rounded the foot of Bree Hill, and then they began to run swiftly downwards into wooded country. To their left they could see some of the houses and hobbit holes of Staddle on the gentler southeastern slopes of the hill. Down in a deep hollow away from the road there were wisps of rising smoke that showed where Combe lay. Archet was hidden in the trees beyond. After the road had run down in some way and had left Bree Hill, standing tall and brown behind, they came on a narrow track that led off toward the north. This is where we leave the open and take to cover, said Strider. Not a short cut, I hope, said Pippin. Our last short cut through the woods nearly ended in disaster. Ha! But you had not got me with you then, laughed Strider. My cuts, short or long, don't go wrong. He took a look up and down the road. No one was in sight, but he led the way quickly down towards the wooded valley. His plan, as far as they could understand it without knowing the country, was to go towards Archet at first, but to bear right and pass it on the east, and then to steer as straight as they could over the wild lands to Weathertop Hill. In that way they would, if all went well, cut off a great loop of the road, which further bent southward to avoid the Midgewater marshes. But of course they would have to pass through the marshes themselves, and Strider's description of them was not encouraging. However, in the meantime, walking was not unpleasant. Indeed, if it had not been for the disturbing events of the night before, they would have enjoyed this part of the journey better than any up to that time. The sun was shining, clear but not too hot. The woods in the valley were still leafy and full of color, and seemed peaceful and wholesome. Strider guided them confidently along many of the crossing paths. Although left to themselves, they would have soon been at a loss. He was taking a wandering course with many turns and doublings to put off any pursuit. Bill Ferny would have watched where we left the road for certain, he said, though I don't think he will follow us himself. He knows the land round here well enough, but he knows he is not a match for me in a wood. It is what he may tell others that I am afraid of. I don't suppose they are far away. If they think we have made for Archet, so much the better. Whether because of Strider's skill or for some other reason, they saw no sign and heard no sound of any other living thing all that day, neither two-footed except birds, nor four-footed except one fox and a few squirrels. The next day they began to steer a steady course eastward, and still all was quiet and peaceful. On the third day out from Bree they came out of the Chetwood. The land had been falling steadily ever since they turned aside from the road, and they now entered a wide, flat expanse of country, much more difficult to manage. They were far beyond the borders of the Bree land, out in the pathless wilderness, and drawing near to the Midgewater marshes. The ground now became damp, and in places boggy, and here and there they came upon pools and wide stretches of reeds and rushes filled with the warbling of little hidden birds. They had to pick their way carefully to keep both dry-footed and on their proper course. At first they made fair progress, but as they went on their passage became slower and more dangerous. The marshes were bewildering and treacherous, and there was no permanent trail even for rangers to find through their shifting quagmires. The flies began to torment them, and the air was full of clouds of tiny midges that crept up their sleeves and breeches and into their hair. "I'm being eaten alive," cried Pippin. "Midgewater, there are more midges than water." "What do they live on when they can't get hobbit?" asked Sam, scratching his neck. They spent a miserable day in this lonely and unpleasant country. Their camping place was damp, cold, and uncomfortable, and the biting insects would not let them sleep. They were also abominable creatures, haunting the reeds and tussocks that from the sound of them were evil relatives of the cricket. There were thousands of them, and they squeaked all round, leek, breek, breek, deek, unceasingly all night, until the hobbits were nearly frantic. The next day, the 4th, was little better, and the night almost as comfortless. Though the Knickerbreakers, as Sam called them, had been left behind, the midges still pursued them. As Frodo lay, tired but unable to close his eyes, it seemed to him that far away there came a light in the eastern sky. It flashed and faded many times. It was not the dawn, for that was still hours off. "What is that light?" he said to Strider, who had risen, and was standing, gazing ahead into the night. "I do not know," Strider answered. "It is too distant to make out. It is like lightning that leaps up from the hilltops." Frodo lay down again, but for a long while he could still see white flashes, and again the tall, dark figure of Strider standing silent and watchful. At last he passed into uneasy sleep. So I could tell you what those lights are. So, they're actually seeing Gandalf. Gandalf is at Weathertop at this point, fighting the Nazgul. They attack him, he fights them off. He leaves them a message, which they will discover in a bit, and then hurries onwards. So that's what the lights are. They had not gone far on the 5th day when they left the last straggling pools and reed beds of the marshes behind them. The land before them began to steadily rise again. Away in the distance eastward they could now see a line of hills. The highest of them was at the right of the lane and a little separated from the others. It had a conical top, slightly flattened at the summit. "That is Weathertop," said Strider. "The old road, which we have left far away on our right, runs to the south of it and passes not far from its foot. We might reach it by noon tomorrow if we go straight towards it. I suppose we had better do so." "What do you mean?" asked Frodo. "I mean, when we do get there, it is not certain what we shall find. It is close to the road." "But surely we were hoping to find Gandalf there." "Yes, but hope is faint. If he comes this way at all, he may not pass through Bree. And so he may not know what we are doing. And anyway, unless by luck we arrive almost together, we shall miss one another. It will not be safe for him to wait for us for that long. If the riders fail to find us in the wilderness, they are likely to make for Weathertop themselves. It commands a wide view all round. Indeed, there are many birds and beasts in this country that could see us as we stand here from that hilltop. Not all the birds are to be trusted, but there are other spies more evil than they are." The hobbits looked anxiously at the distant hills. Sam looked up into the pale sky, fearing to see hawks or eagles hovering above them, with bright, unfriendly eyes. "You do make me feel uncomfortable and lonesome, Strider," he said. "What do you advise us to do?" asked Frodo. "I think," answered Strider slowly, as if he was not quite sure. "I think the best thing to do is to go straight eastward from here as we can, to make for the line of hills, not for Weathertop. There we can strike a path I know for the ruins runs at their feet. It will bring us to Weathertop from the north and less openly. Then we shall see what we shall see." All that day they plodded along, until the cold and early evening came down. The land became drier and more barren, but mists and vapors lay behind them on the marshes. A few melancholy birds were piping and wailing until the round red sun sank slowly into the western shadows, and then an empty silence fell. The hobbits thought of the soft light of sunset glancing through the cheerful windows of Bag End far away. At the day's end they came to a stream that wandered down from the hills to lose itself in the stagnant marshland, and they went up along its banks while the light lasted. It was already night when at last they halted and made their camp under some stunted alder trees by the shores of the stream. Ahead there loomed, now against the dusky sky, the bleak and treeless backs of the hills. That night they set a watch, and Strider, it seemed, did not sleep at all. The moon was waxing, and in the early night hours a cold grey light lay on the land. Next morning they set out again soon after sunrise. There was frost in the air, and the sky was a pale, clear blue. The hobbits felt refreshed, as if they had a night of unbroken sleep. Already they were getting used to much walking on short commons, shorter at any rate than what in the Shire they would have thought barely enough to keep them on their legs. Pippin declared that Frodo was looking twice the hobbit that he had been. "Very odd," said Frodo, tightening his belt, "considering that there is actually a good deal less of me. I hope the thinning process will not go on indefinitely, or I shall become a wraith." "Do not speak of such things," said Strider quickly, and with surprising earnestness. Foreshadowing. Because Frodo is going to become very close to becoming a wraith because of getting stabbed by the Witch King, which is going to happen very soon. So the fact that he mentions it, and Aragorn sort of is like, "Oh, let's not speak of such things." The hills drew nearer. They made an undulating ridge, often rising almost to 1,000 feet. and here and there falling again to low clefts or passes leading to the eastern land beyond. Along the crest of the ridge the hobbits could see what looked to be the remains of green-grown walls and dikes, and in the clefts there still stood the ruins of old works of stone. By night they had reached the feet of the western slopes, and there they camped. It was the night of the 5th of October, and they were 6 days out from Bree. In the morning they found, for the first time since they left the Chetwood, a track plain to see. They turned right and followed it southwards. It ran cunningly, taking a line that seemed chosen as to keep as much hidden as possible from the view, both of the hilltops above and of the flats to the west. It dived into dells and hugged steep banks, and where it passed over flatter and more open ground on either side of it, there were lines of large boulders and hewn stones that screened the travellers almost like a hedge. "I wonder who made this path and what for," said Mary, as they walked along one of these avenues, where the stones were unusually large and closely set. "I am not sure I like it. It has rather a Barrow-whitish look. Is there any Barrow on Weathertop?" "No, there is no Barrow on Weathertop, nor on any of these hills," answered Strider. "The men of the West did not live here, though in their latter days they defended the hills for a while against the evil that came out of Angmar. This path was made to serve the forts along the walls, but long before, in the first days of the North Kingdom, they built a great watchtower on Weathertop. Aemon Sul they called it. It was burned and broken, and nothing remains of it now but a tumbled ring, like a rough crown on the old hill's head. Yet once it was tall and fair. It is told that Elendil stood there, watching for the coming of Gil-galad out of the west in the days of the last alliance." Okay, we're going to learn a little bit about them because Strider sort of tells a poem about it, but the North Kingdom is referring to Arnor, which was Isildur's kingdom, or would have been his kingdom. Of course, Isildur was actually kind of the High King at that point, because Elendil had died, Anarion had died, leaving Isildur to be the High King. Anarion's son becomes the King of Gondor, and Isildur goes to the north to Arnor to set up his kingdom, but I think we have to assume that he was going to make one of his sons the King of Arnor, and that he would be the High King. Of course, that never happened because he didn't make it up there. He was heading to Rivendell. He had urgent things to speak with Elrond about, and he got killed at the disaster of the Gladden Fields. But they're talking about the danger that came out of the north, out of Angmar. That was the Witch King. So there was a period of time where Sauron was thought to be pretty much gone, and the Witch King sort of stepped up to be the next big bad guy. And you think of this sort of diminishment going from Morgoth to Sauron and then to the Witch King. Of course, Sauron returns, but the Witch King pretty much failed. He had a war against Arnor. Gondor helped, but so too did the elves. And the idea that he was looking for the coming of Gil-galad, this is earlier, this is the Second Age, in the days of the Last Alliance. The Last Alliance of Elves and Men refers to the friendship of King Elendil and Gil-galad, who came together to battle Sauron. And it wasn't just Gil-galad, he was the High King of the Noldor, but there were the elves of Mirkwood as well that helped them, and elves from other places and men from other places and such. But it was a big alliance, and that's when Sauron was defeated in the Second Age. The hobbits gazed at Strider. It seemed that he was learned in old lore, as well as the ways of the wild. "Who was Gil-galad?" asked Merry, but Strider did not answer, and seemed to be lost in thought. Suddenly a low voice murmured, "Gil-galad was an elven king, of him the harpers sadly sing. The last whose realm was fair and free, between the mountains and the sea. His sword was long, his lance was keen, his shining helm afar was seen. The countless stars of heaven's field were mirrored in his silver shield. But long ago he rode away, and where he dwelleth none can say, for into darkness fell his star in Mordor where the shadows are." The others turned in amazement, for the voice was Sam's. "Don't stop," said Merry. "That's all I know," stammered Sam, blushing. "I learned it from Mr. Bilbo when I was a lad. He used to tell me tales like that, knowing how I always was one for hearing about elves. It was Mr. Bilbo as taught me my letters. He was mighty book-learned, was dear old Mr. Bilbo, and he wrote poetry. He wrote what I have just said." "He did not make it up," said Strider. "It is part of the lay that is called the Fall of Gil-galad. which is in an ancient tongue. Bilbo must have translated it. I never knew that. There was a lot more, said Sam, all about Mordor. I don't know that part. It gave me the shivers. I never thought I should be going that way myself. Going to Mordor, cried Pippin. I hope it won't come to that. Do not speak that name so loudly, said Strider. It was already midday when they drew near the southern end of the path, and saw before them in the pale, clear light of the October sun a grey-green bank, leading up like a bridge onto the northward slope of the hill. They decided to make for the top at once, while the daylight was broad. Concealment was no longer possible, and they could only hope that no enemy or spy was observing them. Nothing was to be seen moving on the hill. If Gandalf was anywhere about, there was no sign of him. On the western flank of Weathertop they found a sheltered hollow, at the bottom of which there was a bowl-shaped dell with grassy sides. There they left Sam and Pippin with the pony and the packs and luggage. The other three went on. After half an hour's plodding and climb, Strider reached the crown of the hill. Frodo and Merry followed, tired and breathless. The last slope had been steep and rocky. On the top they found, as Strider had said, a wide ring of ancient stonework, now crumbling or covered with age-long grass. But in the center a cairn of broken stones had been piled. They were blackened, as if with fire. About them the turf was burned to the roots, and all within the ring the grass was scorched and shriveled, as if flames had swept up the hilltop, but there was no sign of any living thing. Standing upon the rim of the ruined circle, they saw all round them below a wide prospect, for the most parts of lands empty and featureless, except for patches of woodland away to the south, beyond which they caught here and there the glint of distant water. Beneath them on the southern side there ran a ribbon, the old road, coming out of the west, and winding up and down until it faded, behind a ridge of dark land to the east. Nothing was moving on it. Following its line eastward with their eyes, they saw the mountains. The nearer foothills were brown and somber. Behind them stood taller shapes of gray, and behind those again were high white peaks glimmering among the clouds. "Well, here we are," said Merry, "and very cheerless and uninviting it looks. There is no water and no shelter and no signs of Gandalf, but I don't blame him for not waiting if he even came here." "I wonder," said Strider, looking round thoughtfully. "Even if he was a day or two behind us at Bree, he could have arrived here first. He could ride very swiftly when need presents." Suddenly he stooped and looked at the stone at the top of the cairn. It was flatter than the others and wider, as if it had escaped the fire. He picked it up and examined it, turning it in his fingers. "This has been handled recently," he said. "What do you think of these marks?" On the flat underside, Frodo saw some scratches. There seemed to be a stroke, a dot, and 3 more strokes, he said. "The stroke on the left might be a G-rune with thin branches," said Strider. "It might be a sign left by Gandalf, though one cannot be sure. The scratches are fine, and they certainly look fresh. But the marks might mean something quite different, and have nothing to do with us. Rangers use runes, and they come here sometimes." "What could they mean, even if Gandalf made them?" asked Merry. "I should say," answered Strider, "that they stood for G3, and were a sign that Gandalf was here on October the 3rd. That is 3 days ago now. It would also show that he was in a hurry, and danger was at hand, so that he had no time or did not dare write anything longer or plainer. If that is so, we must be wary." "I wish we could feel sure that he made those marks, whatever they may mean," said Frodo. "It would be a great comfort to know that he was on the way, in front of us or behind us." "Perhaps," said Strider. "For myself, I believe that he was here, and was in danger. There have been scorching flames here, and now the light that we saw 3 nights ago in the eastern sky comes back to my mind. I guess that he was attacked on this hilltop, but with what results I cannot tell. He is here no longer, and we must now look after ourselves and make our way down to Rivendell, as best we can." "How far is Rivendell?" asked Merry, gazing round warily. The world looked wide and wide from Weathertop. "I don't know if the road has ever been measured in miles beyond the Forsaken Inn. A day's journey east of Bree," answered Strider. "Some say it is so far, and some say otherwise. It is a strange road, and folk are glad to reach their journey's end, whether the time is long or short. But I know how long it would take me on my own feet, with fair weather and no ill fortune. 12 days from here to the ford of Bruinen, where the road crosses the Loudwater that runs out of Rivendell. We have at least a fortnight's journey before us, and I do not think we shall be able to use the road." "A fortnight," said Frodo. "A lot may happen in that time." "It may," said Strider. They stood for a while silent on the hilltop near its southward edge. In that lonely place Frodo for the first time fully realized his homelessness and danger. He wished bitterly that his fortune had left him in the quiet and beloved Shire. He stared down at the hateful road, leading back westward to his home. Suddenly he was aware that 2 black specks were moving slowly along it, going westward, and looking again he saw that 3 others were creeping eastward to meet them. He gave a cry and clutched Strider's arm. "Look," he said, pointing downward. At once Strider flung himself on the ground behind the ruined circle, pulling Frodo down beside him. Merry threw himself alongside. "What is it?" he whispered. "I do not know, and I fear the worst," answered Strider. Slowly they crawled up the edge of the ring again, and peering through a cleft between 2 jagged stones, the light was no longer bright, for the clear morning had faded, and the clouds creeping out of the east had now overtaken the sun, and it had begun to go down. They could all see the black specks, but neither Frodo nor Merry could make out their shapes for certain. Yet something told them that there, far below, were black riders assembling on the road beyond the foot of the hill. "Yes," said Strider, whose keener eyes left him in no doubt. "The enemy is here." Oh, man. I was thinking about the emote that you just used, Moogle. I guess next year... I mean, you could still buy subscriptions to people that don't stream anymore, but I know you, and you get gift subs. So I don't know if you could buy gift subs for people that aren't streaming anymore, but I don't know that very many of them will be bought. Hastily they crept away and slipped down on the north side hill to find their companions. Oh, hold on, it didn't scroll properly. You want to buy the subscription even after she's no longer streaming? I mean, you could do that. She'll eventually get the money. Sam and Peregrine had not been idle. They had explored the small dell and the surrounding slopes. Not far away they found a spring of clear water in the hillside, and near it footprints, not more than a day or 2 old. In the dell itself they found recent traces of a fire and other signs of a hasty camp. There were some fallen rocks on the edge of the dell nearest to the hill. Behind them Sam came upon a small store of firewood neatly stacked. "I wonder if old Gandalf has been here," he said to Pippin. "Whoever it was put this stuff here meant to come back to it seems." Strider was greatly interested in these discoveries. "I wish I had waited and explored the ground down here myself," he said, hurrying off to the spring to examine the footprints. "It is just as I feared," he said when he came back. "Sam and Pippin have trampled the soft ground, and the marks are spoilt or confused. Rangers have been here lately. It is they who left the firewood behind, but there are also several newer tracks that were not made by rangers. At least one set was made only a day or 2 ago by heavy boots. At least one. I cannot now be certain, but I think there may be booted feet." He paused and stood in anxious thought. Each of the hobbits saw in his mind a vision of the cloaked and booted riders. If the horsemen had already found the dell, the sooner Strider led them somewhere else, the better. Sam viewed the hollow with great dislike now that he had heard news of their enemies on the road only a few miles away. "Hadn't we better clear out quick, Mr. Strider?" he asked impatiently. "It is getting late, and I don't like this hole. It makes my heart sink somehow." "Yes, we certainly must decide what to do at once," answered Strider, looking up and considering the time and weather. "Well, Sam," he said at last, "I do not like this place either, but I cannot think of anywhere better that we should reach before nightfall. At least we are out of sight for the moment, and if we moved we should be much more likely to be seen by spies. All we could do would be to go out right out of our way back north on this side of the line of hills, where the land is all much the same as it is here. The road is watched, but we should have to cross it if we try to take cover in the thickets away down the south. On the north side of the road behind the hills the country is bare and flat for miles." "Can the riders see?" asked Merry. "I mean, they seem usually to have used their noses rather than their eyes, smelling for us, if smelling is the right word, at least in the daylight. But you make us lie down flat when you saw them down below, and now you talk of being seen if we move." "I was too careless on the hilltop," answered Strider. "I was very anxious to find some sign of Gandalf, but it was a mistake for 3 of us to go up and stand there so long. For the black horses can see, and the riders can use men and other creatures as spies, as we found out in Bree. They themselves do not see the world of light as we do, but our shapes cast shadows in their mind, which only the noon sun destroys, and in the dark they pursue many signs and forms that are hidden from us. Then they are most to be feared. and at all times they smell the blood of living things, desiring and hating it. Senses, too, there are other than sight or smell. We can feel their presence and troubles our hearts. As soon as we came here, and before we saw them, they feel ours more keenly. Also, he added, and his voice sank to a whisper, the ring draws them. Is there no escape, then? Said Frodo, looking round wildly. If I move, I shall be seen and hunted. If I stay, I shall draw them to me. Strider laid his hand on his shoulder. There is still hope, he said. You are not alone. Let us take this wood that is ready for the fire as a sign. There is little shelter or defense here, but fire shall serve for both. Sauron can put fire to his evil uses, as he can all things. But these riders do not love it, and fear those who wield it. Fire is our friend in the wilderness. Maybe, muttered Sam. It is also a good way of saying, here we are, as I can think of, bar shouting. So to pause here briefly, obviously, Aragorn mentions about how they really don't see like we do. I talked about that earlier. But what's really interesting here is the movie. In the movie version of The Fellowship of the Ring, there's this part where Frodo is sort of sleeping, and then he wakes up, and the other three hobbits they have a fire going, and they're cooking. They're like, oh, come here, nice crispy bacon, And he starts yelling, put it out, because he's afraid that the fire is going to draw the Nazgul to them. Sam has the same thought, that they're going to see the fire and therefore know where they are. But the thing is, they already know where they are. They've seen them. Or should I say the horses saw them. The horses can see for them, as Aragorn pointed out, which is a large part of why they use these horses, other than just simple transportation. But we learn here that they don't like fire. The fire is not going to draw them. The ring might draw them, but the fire is not going to draw them. As a matter of fact, they're afraid of it. And it's sort of the opposite, where in the movie, Frodo and Aragorn are yelling at them to put out the one fire they have. And at one point, which is coming up soon, Aragorn is like, let's light some more fires, because it'll keep them away. Also, it mentions that our shapes cast shadows in their minds, which are only destroyed by the noon sun, which is sort of the only thing that harkens back to something mentioned in The Hobbit, which is never brought up in any other book about the One Ring. Of course, when you put on the One Ring, you're drawn into the Wraith world. You don't really become a spirit, but you become something like a spirit. Where you have substance, but people can see you because they can't see spirits. You're in a spirit world, but even though you are not a spirit yourself. And it's mentioned in The Hobbit that in very, very bright light, you would cast a pale shadow. So while you're invisible, you do cast a shadow if the light is very bright. And that's sort of like the opposing idea that the Nazgul see us as shadows, but can't see those shadows in very, very bright light. Down in the lowest and most sheltered corner of the dell, they lit a fire and prepared a meal. The shades of evening began to fall, and it grew cold. They were suddenly aware of great hunger, for they had not eaten anything since breakfast, but they dared not make more than a frugal supper. The lands ahead were empty of all save birds and beasts, unfriendly places, deserted by all the races of the world. Rangers passed at times beyond the hills, but they were few and did not stay. Other wanderers were rare and of evil sort. Trolls might stray down at times out of the northern valleys of the Misty Mountains. Only on the road would travelers be found, most often dwarves, hurrying along on business of their own, and with no help and a few words to spare for strangers. I don't see how our food can be made to last, said Frodo. We've been careful enough in the last few days, and this supper is no feast. But we have used more than we ought, if we have 2 weeks still to go and perhaps more. There is food in the wild, said Strider, berry, root, and herb, and I have some skill as a hunter at need. You do not need to be afraid of starving before winter comes, but gathering and catching food is long and weary work, and we need haste. So tighten your belts and think with hope at the tables at Elrond's house. The cold increased as darkness came on. Peering out from the edge of the dell, they could see nothing but grey land, now vanishing quickly into shadow. The sky above had cleared again and was slowly filled with twinkling stars. Frodo and his companions huddled round the fire, wrapped in every garment and blanket they possessed, but Strider was content with a single cloak, and sat a little apart, drawing thoughtfully at his pipe. As night fell, and the light of the fire began to shine out brightly, he began to tell them tales to keep their minds from fear. He knew many histories and legends of long ago, of elves and men, and the good and evil deeds of the elder days. They wondered how old he was, and where he had learned all this lore. "Tell us of Gil-galad," said Merry suddenly, when he paused at the end of a story of the elf kingdoms. "Do you know any more of that old lay you spoke of?" "I do indeed," answered Strider. "So does Frodo, for it concerns us closely." Merry and Pippin looked at Frodo, who was staring into the fire. "I know only the little that Gandalf has told me," said Frodo slowly. "Gil-galad was the last of the great elf kings of Middle-earth. Gil-galad is starlight in their tongue. With Elendil, the elf friend, he went to the land of—" "No," said Strider, interrupting. "I do not think that tale should be told now with the servants of the enemy at hand. If we win through to the house of Elrond, you may hear it there told in full." "Then tell us some other tale of the old days," begged Sam. "A tale about the elves before the fading time. I would dearly like to hear more about elves. The dark seems to press round so close." "I will tell you the tale of Tinuviel," said Strider, "in brief, for it is a long tale, of which the end is not known, and there are none now except Elrond that remember it, aright as if it was told of old. It is a fair tale, though it is sad, as are all the tales in Middle-earth, and yet it may lift up your hearts." He was silent for some time, and then he began, not to speak, but to chant softly. "The leaves were long, the grass was green, the hemlock umbels tall and fair, and in the glade a light was seen, of stars and shadows shimmering. Tinuviel was dancing there, to music of a pipe unseen, and light of stars was in her hair and in her raiment glimmering. There Beren came from mountains cold, and lost he wandered under leaves, and where the elven river rolled, he walked alone and sorrowing. He peered between the hemlock leaves, and saw in wonder flowers of gold upon her mantle and her sleeves, and her hair like shadow following. Enchantment healed his weary feet, that over hills were doomed to roam, and forth he hastened strong and fleet, and grasped at moonbeams glistening. Though woven woods and elven home, she lightly fled on dancing feet, and left him lonely still to roam, in the silent forest listening. He heard thereof the flying sound of feet as light as linden leaves, of music welling underground, in hidden hollows quavering. Now within lay the hemlock sheaves, and one by one with sighing sound, whispering fell the beechen leaves in the wintry woodland wavering. He sought her ever, wandering far, where leaves of years were thickly strewn, by light of moon and ray of star, and frosty heavens shivering. Her mantle glinted in the moon, as on a hilltop high and far, she danced, and at her feet was strewn a mist of silver quavering. When winter passed, she came again, and her song released from sudden spring, like rising lark and falling rain and melting water bubbling. He saw the elfin flowers spring about her feet and healed again. He longed by her to dance and sing upon the grass untroubling. Again she fled, but swift he came. Tinuviel, Tinuviel, he called her by her elvish name, and there she halted listening. One moment stood she, and a spell, his voice laid on her, Beren came, and doom fell on Tinuviel, that in his arms lay glistening. As Beren looked into her eyes, within the shadows of her hair, the trembling starlight of the skies, he saw there mirrored shimmering. Tinuviel the elven fair, immortal maiden elven wise, about him cast her shadowy hair, and arms like silver glimmering. Long was the way that fate them bore o'er stony mountain cold and grey, through halls of iron and darkling door, and woods of nightshade morrowless. The sundering seas between them lay, and yet at last they met once more. And long ago they passed away, in the forest singing sorrowless. Strider sighed, and paused before he spoke again. "That is a song," he said, "in the mode that is called Anthenath among the elves, but is harder to render in our common speech. And this is but a rough echo of it. It tells of the meeting of Beren, son of Barahir, and Luthien Tinuviel. Beren was a mortal man, but Luthien was the daughter of Thingol, a king of elves upon Middle-earth when the world was young, and she was the fairest maiden that had ever been among the children of this world. As the stars above the mist of the northern lands was her loveliness, and in her face a shining light. In those days the great enemy, of whom Sauron of Mordor was but a servant, dwelt in Angband in the north. And the elves of the west coming back to Middle-earth made war upon him to regain the Silmarils which he had stolen. And the fathers of men aided the elves. But the enemy was victorious, and Barahir was slain. And Beren, escaping through great peril, came over the mountains of terror, into the hidden kingdom of Thingol, and the forest of Neldoreth. Then he beheld Luthien singing and dancing in a glade beside the enchanted river Esgalduin. And he named her Tinuviel, that is nightingale in the language of old. Many sorrows befell them afterwards, and they were parted long. Tinuviel rescued Beren from the dungeons of Sauron, and together they passed through great dangers and cast down even the great enemy from his throne, and took from his iron crown one of the 3 Silmarils, brightest of all jewels, to be the bride piece of Luthien to Thingol her father. Yet at the last Beren was slain by the wolf that came from the gates of Angband, and he died in the arms of Tinuviel. But she chose mortality, and to die from the world, so that she might follow him. And it is sung that they met again, beyond the sundering seas, and after a brief time, walking alive once more in the green woods, together they passed long ago, beyond the confines of this world. So it is said that Luthien Tinuviel, alone, of the elf kindred, has died indeed, and left the world, and they have lost her whom they most loved. But from after her, the lineage of the elf lords of old descended among men. There still live those of whom Luthien was the foremother, and it is said that her line shall never fail. Elrond of Rivendell is of that kin. For of Beren and Luthien was born Dil Thingol's heir, and of him Elwing the White, whom Earendil wedded. He that sailed his ship out of the mists of the world into the seas of heaven with the Silmaril upon his brow, and of Earendil came the kings of Numenor, that is Westerness. We have to pause and talk about this. We're sort of like running a little late here, but there's only like a page and a half left, so it's okay. But so much there. The story of Beren and Luthien, and we're going to eventually read that because we're going to read through all of the Lord of the Rings, and we're going to read the Silmarillion. And Aragorn is getting pieces of the story here. He says like not a lot of people know how it ends at this point. We know the basic story, and the actual poetry, the Lay of Luthien, where she's only referred to as Tinuviel, you can get that in the book Beren and Luthien. There's a lot of different versions of Beren and Luthien, and they're all sort of collected there. The version from the Silmarillion, that old poem, even older versions where Luthien is a fairy and Beren is an elf. The story of Beren and Luthien is really the story of J.R.R. Tolkien and his wife Edith. He was her Luthien, and if you ever are in Oxford, in the United Kingdom, and you visit the gravesite where J.R.R. Tolkien and his wife are laid to rest, you'll see that his grave says Beren, hers says Luthien. And the idea of Luthien giving up her immortality to be with Beren was sort of based on the idea that Edith gave up her religion to be with Tolkien, because I believe she was Anglican, or she might have been in the Church of England, and he of course was a Catholic, and he was actually forbidden to see her until he turned 21 by this sort of father. Tolkien didn't really know his father all that well, but he had this father figure who was a priest, and this guy was very puritanical, and he insisted that he not date until he was 21, and that even then, the woman that he wanted to marry, he already knew that he met Edith when he was 17. He knew he was going to marry her, that she had to be Catholic. She had to convert to Catholicism. And Tolkien was sort of thinking of this as he lay in a hospital after World War I, and she's tending to him. And this is where he first wrote Beren and Luthien. Long before The Hobbit, long before The Lord of the Rings, he wrote Beren and Luthien. And, there were other stories that he wrote in the same time period, like The Children of Húrin and The Fall of Gondolin, in their primitive forms. But what's interesting here is he's thinking of this as the way of, obviously I believe my religion is correct, and that I'm going to go to heaven and all this. But she also believed the same thing of her religion, and she was willing to give that up to be with me. That's sort of like giving up immortality to be with a mortal man. And that was the inspiration of Beren and Luthien Senuvial. And what's really interesting here is that Aragorn is very passionate about this. He mentions there are some that are descended from this. And he talks about Elrond. And he sort of glosses at the end, yes, and the kings of Numenor. He doesn't mention himself, that he is directly descended from Beren and Luthien. And Beren, they mentioned that his father's name was Barahir, and Aragorn, at this moment that he's telling the story, is wearing Barahir's ring, which was made for Barahir by the dwarves a long time ago. One of the oldest artifacts in Middle-earth. He's wearing it right now. Of course, he doesn't mention this at this point. He doesn't really want the hobbits to know who he really, really is, that he is the king. Or he will become the king. They've gotten hints at it about the poem, "All that is gold does not glitter, not all who wander are lost." He's gold, he doesn't glitter. He's sort of a weather-beaten man. He cleans up nicely, but he's not very handsome. But he's gold. He's worth his weight in gold. Not all who wander are lost. He's Strider. He's the wanderer, but he's not lost. Every line in that poem is about him, and we talk about the sword that was broken being reforged and the kingdom being reunited. And we learn later that it was Bilbo Baggins that wrote that poem about him. But this is very near and dear to his heart, not just because he's descended from Beren, but because he is in love with Elrond's daughter Arwen, who looks almost exactly like Luthien. So he's seeing himself as Beren in this. And what's interesting is that Arwen was added very late. The original idea, I mean, you guys know I talked about it earlier, the original idea was there was no Aragorn, there was Trotter. And when Trotter became Strider, Strider became Aragorn. The idea was that he would marry Éowyn. But Éowyn was sort of a different character at that point, too. And she got combined with another character who was actually Theoden's daughter, Theodred's sister. And that was Idis. And a lot of Idis's personality traits were given to Éowyn, and they were sort of combined into one character. She was supposed to marry Aragorn at the end of the story. But as Tolkien reflected on the idea that Aragorn is a Third Age analog to Beren, she needed a Third Age analog to Luthien, and thus Arwen was created. And because it was so late in the story, in the writing, I should say, not in the story, that's why Arwen doesn't have a much bigger part in the main text. Now, in The Return of the King here, there's a whole part in the appendix called The Tale of Arwen and Aragorn that tells the story, the love story between them, that is not in the main text. And there's other bits of the Lord of the Rings that didn't make it into the Lord of the Rings, like the quest for Erebor that I mentioned earlier as an example. Just to give you guys a little insight into Tolkien's writing process and thought process and inspiration for Beren and Luthien being his own life, him and his wife. All right, let's finish. There's only, like I said, about a page and a half left of A Knife in the Dark, and then we'll end for today. As Strider was speaking, they watched his strange, eager face, dimly lit in the red glow of the wood fire. His eyes shone and his voice was rich and deep. Above him was a black, starry sky. Suddenly a pale light appeared over the crown of Weathertop behind him. The waxing moon was climbing slowly above the hill that overshadowed them, and the stars above the hilltop faded. The story ended. The hobbits moved and stretched. "Look," said Merry, "the moon is rising. It must be getting late." The others looked up. Even as they did so, they saw at the top of the hill something small and dark against the glimmer of the moonrise. It was perhaps only a large stone or jutting rock shown up by the pale light. Sam and Merry got up and walked away from the fire. Frodo and Pippin remained seated in silence. Strider was watching the moonlight on the hill intently. All seemed quiet and still, but Frodo felt a cold dread creeping over his heart, now that Strider was no longer speaking. He huddled closer to the fire. At that moment, Sam came running back from the cliff at the edge. "I don't know what it is," he said, "but I suddenly felt afraid. I durstn't go outside the dell for any money if I felt that there was something creeping up the slope." "Did you see anything?" asked Frodo, springing to his feet. "No, sir, I saw nothing, but I didn't stop to look." "I saw something," said Merry, "or I thought I did, away westward, where the moonlight was falling on the flats beyond the shadow of the hilltops. I thought there were 2 or 3 black shapes. They seemed to be moving this way." "Keep close to the fire, with your faces outward," cried Strider. "Get some of the longer sticks ready in your hands." For a breathless time they sat there, silent and alert, with their backs turned to the wood fire, each gazing into the shadows that encircled them. Nothing happened. There was no sound or movement in the night. Frodo stirred, feeling that he must break the silence. He longed to shout out aloud. "Hush!" whispered Strider. "What's that?" gasped Pippin at the same moment. Over the lip of the little dell, on away in the side way from the hill, they felt rather than saw a shadow rise. One shadow or more than one. They strained their eyes, and the shadows seemed to grow. Soon there could be no doubt 3 or 4 tall black figures were standing there on the slope, looking down at them. So black were they that they seemed like black holes in the deep shade behind them. Frodo thought that he heard a faint hiss, as of venomous breath, and felt a thin, piercing chill. Then the shapes slowly advanced. Terror overcame Pippin and Merry, and they threw themselves flat on the ground. Sam shrank to Frodo's side. Frodo was hardly less terrified than his companions. He was quaking, as if it was bitter cold, but his terror was swallowed up in a sudden temptation to put on the ring. The desire to do so laid hold of him, and he could think of nothing else. He did not forget the barrow nor the message of Gandalf, but something seemed to be compelling him to disregard all warnings, and he longed to yield. Not with the hope of escape, or of doing anything, either good or bad. He simply felt that he must take the ring and put it on his finger. He could not speak. He felt Sam looking at him, as if he knew that his master was in some great trouble, but he could not turn towards him. He shut his eyes and struggled for a while, but resistance became unbearable, and at last he slowly drew out the chain and slipped the ring under the forefinger of his left hand. Immediately, though everything else remained as before, dim and dark, the shapes became terribly clear. He was able to see beneath their black wrappings. There were 5 tall figures, 2 standing on the lip of the dell, 3 advancing. In their white faces burned keen and merciless eyes. Under their mantles were long grey robes. Upon their grey hairs were helms of silver. In their haggard hands they were swords of steel. Their eyes fell on him and pierced him. And as they rushed towards him, desperate, he drew his own sword, and it seemed to him that it flickered red, as if it were a firebrand. 2 of the figures halted. The third was taller than the others. His hair was long and gleaming, and on his helm was a crown. In one hand he held a long sword, and in the other a knife. Both the knife and the hand that held it glowed with a pale light. He sprang forward and bore down on Frodo. At that moment Frodo threw himself forward on the ground, and he heard himself crying aloud, "O Elbereth Githoniel!" At the same time he struck at the feet of his enemy. A shrill cry rang out in the night, and he felt a pain like a dart of poisoned ice pierce his left shoulder. Even as he swooned he caught, as though in a swirling mist, a glimpse of Strider leaping out of the darkness with a flaming brand of wood in either hand. With a last effort Frodo, dropping his sword, slipped the ring from his finger and closed his right hand tight about it. And that's the end of the chapter. That's 11 chapters we've gotten through. So just to talk about that, there's only really one thing to mention. I already talked about how he puts on the ring and he can see them clearly. There's 3 of them. The one in the middle is the Witch King of Angmar. And he cries out this strange sort of speech, "O Elbereth Githoniel." He's actually speaking Sindarin, though he doesn't really know what he's saying at this moment. But he is invoking the name of one of the Valar, specifically Varda, who's also known as Elbereth Githoniel in Sindarin. Varda, I mentioned her earlier, she's the one that made the stars. She's also the queen of the world. Out of all the Valar are the top 15 angels of the world. Even Melkor was one of them. And so they could have cast him out of his order. He's still a Vala, but he's cast out of their order. So there's 14 of them. And among them, there's 8 that are especially high up. They're called the Aratar. But there are 2 that are the king and queen of the entire world. Not of Middle-earth, not of the Undying but all of the world, the created world, the universe. And they're called Manwe, is the king and Varda is the queen. And he just invoked their names against Sauron's minions. And it's explained later that this did a lot more to them than him sort of slashing at them with his sword, which didn't go so well for him. He got stabbed in the shoulder. We'll read more about what happens next. We're going to meet another character, Glorfindel, in the next chapter, who was replaced in every adaptation in the 1978 animated film that Ralph Bakshi made. He took Glorfindel out of the story and he put Legolas there. And Peter Jackson's version made it Arwen. And I actually like the version where it's Arwen, even though I would have preferred it to be Glorfindel. Legolas didn't make a lot of sense there. But, I mean, it made sense in the sense that we're getting to know Legolas a little bit earlier. But I would have liked Glorfindel because he is sort of important. Not in this story. He only has like two scenes in this story. He's important in the Silmarillion and the Fall of Gondolin specifically. But anyway, guys, I hope you guys all enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun reading for you guys and talking about the text and sort of breaking it down as much as we can and analyzing it and going over a lot of the deeper lore and such. So I'm going to tentatively schedule our next Tolkien stream. Our next Tolkien stream will be on the 2nd because that's going to be me and Matt and Sid doing the Council of Tolkien. But our next reading stream, I'm going to tentatively say, okay, well, you actually have 5 Thursdays in January. So if we assume that List Critics would be on the 30th, Council of Tolkien on the 2nd. So I would like to make the 9th and the 23rd X-Men Legends streams, which would leave us with the reading stream on the 16th of January. Oh, thank you so much for coming by and sticking through the whole thing. I'm gonna plug a few things, and we're gonna go over the streaming schedule for the next week, and then we're gonna raid somebody. So ask everybody that's here to stick around. Don't go anywhere. Stay through to the end of the broadcast. The next reading stream should be the 16th. But if you haven't been to my YouTube, and I'm sure that some of the people here, and thank you for thanking me. I mean, you're welcome is what I should say. I do have a lot of passion for this. It is, like I said, it's like basically my life's work. I'm going to put a link to my YouTube page. For those of you that are watching on YouTube later on, this is useless to you. But for anybody who is interested in me answering Tolkien questions and where these streams go afterwards, that is a link there. I'm also going to link to my Quora account because that's where I primarily write what becomes the question and answer videos on my YouTube channel. So there's a link to my Quora account. You can ask me any question there. Of course, you don't have to go there. If you want to ask a question, you can come by a stream, or you can just leave me a comment on any video and I'll get to it. But if you want like a long, detailed answer and possibly be featured in a video, that's where you want to go. And also, we have a Discord channel. It is primarily keyed to this particular Twitch channel, so it's a lot of gaming talk and streaming talk and such. But if you want to talk to me on there as well, I'm just going to put a link there. You know, we do talk about Tolkien on there sometimes. And oh, that's not it. Ignore that. I didn't do it right. Let's try that again. Oh, it's not working. It says use copy button, but that's what I did. Moogle, could you grab a Discord link? It's not working for me right now. Thank you. All right. So I do stream every day, so if you like video games as well, let me go over the schedule here. So I have to go to a different scene for that, though. I have to go to this scene. And so tomorrow afternoon, I will be live playing Chrono Cross. Thank you, Knobby Knobs, and you have a great rest of your evening as well. Like I said, please stick around through the end of the broadcast, because it does help me to have a raid with a lot of people in there. So tomorrow is Chrono Cross. Saturday night, we will be doing Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Sunday night, we got Castlevania Lords of Shadow. Monday afternoon, Street Fighter 4. Tuesday night, oh, that's not it, Cookie Cutter Tuesday night. Wednesday afternoon, Oblivion. And then Thursday, a week from today, I don't have the scene set up, but it will be the List Critics podcast with me and Jesse and Elise. So let's go over to here, and we're going to pick out somebody to raid. Now, if Corey Olsen's on, I would love to raid him because he's, you know, the inspiration for all this. He even got mentioned earlier. That's who I would like to raid if he's currently broadcasting. Let's see. There's a lot of people on. Unfortunately, Corey's not on. It's a bit late for him anyway. That means we'll probably just raid Captain Retro, right? What is he playing? Zelda 2? He's still not through that? Wow. He really takes his time. I guess he enjoys it then, right? Okay, he's got his kids there saying goodnight. Let's go raid him. I'm going to make my raid call the Elboreth Githoniel. Just give me a moment to put that in there. Spell Githoniel correctly. Okay. So there is the raid call. So everybody just copy that into your clipboard and then paste it once the stream ends and you're seeing Captain Retro. So we'll see you guys over there. We'll see you guys on Discord, Quora, YouTube, whatever. Tomorrow for Chrono Cross. That's always fun. Another game with a lot of lore to talk about. And here we go.